The story begins with a violent explosion on a cliff, and as the dust begins to settle, a man approaches, striking downward with a powerful blow. The other man laughs, impressed, asking how it is that his opponent is still able to move despite such a severe injury. Before he added an elaboration that his mental fortitude matches his title of the Phantom Swordsman. He admits that the sword technique his opponent created is impressive, but with a push backward, he adds that the Phantom Swordsman won't be able to use internal energy in his current state. He pushed the injured man with more power before he spoke once more. It is miraculous enough that he is still able to move, and there's no need to continue fighting, as he plans to end it and put his opponent to sleep. Imbuing a purple aura into his blade, the man draws it back and swings forward, sending multiple sword arc made of inner energy of attacks at the Phantom Swordsman. While his opponent is busy deflecting them, the man rushes in, delivering a powerful kick to his gut, causing the Phantom Swordsman to fall to the ground. The man then stabs downward toward his head, but the Phantom Swordsman rolls to the side to avoid it. He quickly counters, delivering a kick that knocks the man's sword from his grasp, sending it flying through the air. The Phantom Swordsman grabs his own blade and thrusts forward, but the man dodges, though the blade still grazes his cheek. The Phantom Swordsman follows up with a left hook to the man's face, knocking him to the ground. The man, now lying on the floor, insists that he won't let his opponent win. He imbues inner energy into his hands and releases an aura wave, despite being unarmed. To his surprise, he finds that the Phantom Swordsman is no longer there, leaving him to wonder where he has gone. As he looks up, horror spreads across his face, just in time to see the Phantom Swordsman descending from the air. In a single swift motion, the Phantom Swordsman cuts him down the middle. The scene shifts to another man, sighing in relief. He asks the Phantom Swordsman if he has killed the old demon head, to which the Phantom Swordsman confirms. With the old demon head gone, the bloodbath, the Shangxi massacre, will finally come to an end. The man refers to the mysterious group known as the Black Knight Palace, who had swept through numerous smaller sects and clans in the last 3 days. He reflects on how the world was able to witness the alliance of 2 rival factions, the Orthodox and Unorthodox, because of this incident. The Phantom Swordsman's true name is revealed to be Dako Hien, and the other man recalls a promise they made to duel after creating their own sword techniques. Sadly, he admits that he will not be able to fulfill it. When asked if that is what he's thinking about in his final moments, the man responds affirmatively, laughing. He has dedicated his entire life to the sword and has fought countless martial artists, witnessing many techniques. Yet, none have been as difficult to deal with as the Phantom Swordsman's. His devotion to the sword surpasses all others, and because of that, he asks the Phantom Swordsman to look after his disciple in Manhwa Sect. Dako Hien, surprised, asks if the man has lost his mind, especially since the disciple belongs to the Manhwa Sect. He is asking why the best swordsman of the unorthodox faction would look after a disciple of the orthodox faction. The dying man hands him a beaded circlet, the plum blossom spirit beads, a relic of Manhwa, and asks him to give it to the sect leader. Dako Hien wonders if the man is truly out of his mind, but soon realizes that this is the earnest wish of a dying man. The man laughs, saying that they are only sword friends, but he has always been grateful. Dako Hien agrees, noting that he will spend the rest of his life at Manhua, thanks to his friend. Before he can finish his sentence, the man's body explodes, turning into red mist, leaving only chunks of his remains behind. Dako Hien is left stunned, wondering what just happened. He turns, only to see a purple light as an inner energy flies toward him. Gritting his teeth, Dako Hien tightens his grip on his blade and asks who is responsible for this, returning a swing to deflect the attack. However, the aura wave is too powerful and destroys his counterattack effortlessly. In genuine surprise, Dako Hien watches as his opponent begins preparing 2 black-purple concentration of inner energy, 1 in each hand. The ensuing blast can only be described as epitome of a destruction. When the smoke clears, Dako Hien, now missing an arm and severely injured, sits on his knees, questioning how someone could be so powerful. As he approaches his own final moments, he wonders if this is the Night Palace Master, though he quickly dismisses the idea, knowing that the old demon head is still dead and his corpse remains intact. It seemed that the mysterious figure was either a hidden disciple or, perhaps, the true Night Palace Master, much stronger than the imposter he had killed. Hien, gazing at his severed arm, murmurs an apology, regretful that he never had the chance to bring his long friend's body back home. It seems both of them will die on this cliff, but with determination, Hyun slams his hand onto his knee, promising that, at the very least, he will keep his word. The other man watches in surprise as Hyun charges forward to fight, unarmed and undeterred. Hyun himself isn't sure if he will survive the fall from the cliff after losing his companion. But if there is any hope, he has to believe in it. Though he may be fleeing now, he will never forget his fallen friend. When they meet again, it will be for the final confrontation. But of course, that chance will never come. Just as Hyun runs, an attack cuts him directly in half. He turns in shock, realizing that the masked man launched the attack from a distance, his power much greater than Hyun had initially thought. The masked man laughs after landing the blow, prompting Hyun to retort that such laughter is disrespectful, especially in someone's final moments. As he begins to fall, his final words are an apology to his friend, admitting that he likely won't be able to keep the promise he made. The spirit beads on his hand start glowing brightly, and below, in the forest, the light is radiated. People say they can feel his pulse, marveling that the heavens have indeed helped him. Hyun, now regaining consciousness, is astonished. He opens his eyes and hears people calling him senior disciple. One of the men yells for an elder, who rushes to Hyun's side, calling him manhua, praising him for surviving. Hyun, confused, recognizes the elder as the Manhwa Sect's elder, Baekjin, but wonders why the man keeps calling him manhua. After all, manhua is the senior disciple of Manhwa's second-generation disciples and his own friend, Hyunjo's disciple. Hyun wonders if the elder has lost his mind. The elder tells him not to speak as his wounds haven't fully healed. Hyun begins to realize that he might be forced to live in Manhwa after all. After some time, Dako Hyun begins to leave, and the elder asks if he is going. Dako Hyun acknowledges, almost responding rudely, but Baekjin advises him not to push himself too hard, as he had been bedridden and unable to eat for the past week. Dako Hyun agrees and steps outside, where the sights of a giant well and a grand temple greet him. He heads toward the garden area, splashing water onto his face, reflecting on the past week. Though only 7 days have passed, it feels as though years have passed to him. He has dreamt of an entire life, reliving the last 2 decades that manhua experienced. It is revealed that their sect had been attacked. One of their buildings explodes and soldiers are fighting valiantly, but the situation seems dire. Standing among the chaos is none other than the Black Knight Palace Master, or at least, the imposter he had seen earlier. As Dako Hyun learns manhua's life, he hears Hyunjo shouting at the masked man before charging in to confront him. Manhua watches as a man raises a weapon to kill one of his fellow disciples, and without hesitation, he dashes forward to block the attack. However, he is struck across the chest, falling to the ground like a warrior from that attack. Dako Hyun, seeing this, calls manhua a fool, asking why he would throw himself in harm's way when his body was so weak. The injury proves fatal, and Dako Hyun realizes that the light from earlier must have come from the spirit beads. Now he wonders why it had to be him. Why manhua and not Hyunjo? Wondering whether that is fate. Sighing, Dako Hyun acknowledges that, despite his reluctance, he cannot waste this second chance at life. He vows to find the masked man and exact his revenge, determined to become stronger than ever before. After all, he had nearly perished at the hands of the imposter, and if he hoped to defeat him, he would need to surpass his previous limits. Dako Hyun walks up the steps to an empty training room, likely Hyunjo's, and reflects on his late friend's final words. Hyunjo had led their disciples bravely, urging them to protect their home without fear. As Dako Hyun picks up a book from the wall, he makes a promise to fulfill Hyunjo's last request and avenge his death, no matter the cost. The scene shifts to a discussion among the elders, who are deliberating whether they need to rebuild a total of 8 pavilions. Among them informs the sect leader that the damage has been worsened because they were unable to extinguish the last ambush's fire in time. The sect leader sighs, assuming that they lack the funds for such an extensive project due to prior damages. He turns to Baek-san, asking if that is the case. Baek-san confirms, adding that profits and visitors will be drastically reduced. He appears to be the one in charge of the sect's finances. The sect leader falls silent, concluding that large expenditures must be avoided, suggesting they should start with the most important pavilions. His name is Baekyu. He then turns to Baekjin, asking how the disciples are recovering. Baek Jin responds that they are all recovering well, and even those in serious condition are improving. Baek Yu is relieved, but asks about Mu Hui, expressing concern that the news of Hyun-jo's death must have been a great shock. Baek Jin reassures him that Mu Hui has taken it better than expected. His wounds have healed significantly, and he was walking around outside yesterday. Baek San laughs, questioning if Mu Hui is truly feeling that much better. Baek Yu agrees that it's good if Mu Hui is taking it well, but advises Baek Jin to check on him occasionally, worried that Mu Hui might be pretending to be fine. He hopes that Mu Hui will be alright, as they all know what kind of person he is. Meanwhile, Dako Hyun is inside the house, reading through martial arts manuals. As he reads, something catches his attention, triggering a memory of Hyun-jo asking him about the disciples. Hyun-jo had inquired what Dako Hyun thought of them, to which Dako Hyun had replied they were useless. Hyun-jo agreed, noting that the sect seemed to be regressing. He found it ironic that they clung to the belief that the plum blossom sword technique, which represented variability and illusions, was perfection. Hyun-jo was certain that Dako Hyun understood the future consequences of a sect that failed to reflect and innovate. Dako Hyun had pointed out that such stagnation could lead to their downfall. Hyun-jo acknowledged the truth of this, but emphasized that change could not be forced. Dako Hyun, however, had insisted that if he were in Hyun-jo's position, he would try to push for change, asking if Hyun-jo had any other ideas. As the plum blossoms began to fall around them, Hyun-jo shared his thoughts. He believed that the only way forward was to show the disciples that the plum blossom sword technique was not the end, but rather a stepping stone to a higher realm. Dako Hyun asked if this was why Hyun-jo had made the promise to create their own sword techniques and duel in the future. Hyun-jo explained that he had reached his current level by renovating various martial techniques, and he thought it might be possible for Dako Hyun, given his title as the Phantom Swordsman and his standing as the best swordsman in his faction. Dako Hyun, reflecting on his initial judgment of the Manhwa sect, admitted that he had once thought the problem lay in the sect's decline, unable to produce talent beyond Hyun-jo for the last century. However, he now realized how foolish he had been. He had focused on martial arts techniques like the six-fold combo circulation technique and the sword technique itself, seeing them as flawless. But he now understood that martial techniques grow in power over time as they are passed through the hands of others. This was the true strength of a sect, and Manhwa had hit a wall because of its greatness. The sect's determination to break through that wall by showing the disciples a new realm was key. If Hyun-jo's wish was to demonstrate this determination and lead the disciples to a higher understanding, then the unfinished sword technique would be Dako Hyun's to complete, as a way to honor their promise. This sword technique would need to reflect not just Manhwa's form and movements, but its deeper intentions. To achieve this, Dako Hyun realized he must align himself with the teachings of the sect and start from the basics. Only then could he complete Hyun-jo's sword technique. Sitting in a lotus position, Dako Hyun begins cultivating his inner energy, letting out a slow exhale. He reflects on the need to let go of the martial arts teachings that Hyun-jo had imparted to him. Even if he tried, he could not deny that they were part of him, and he could not underestimate the basics. The autumn flower circulation technique, for instance, was stable and not inferior to the ghost arts. In his past life, Dako Hyun had only sought efficiency and used unorthodox sword techniques. However, the techniques of the Manhwa sect were different, and he might learn something entirely new from them. This marked the end of his life as the Phantom Swordsman. From now on, Dako Hyun would fully embrace his new identity, Mu Hui. Some time later, a man is seen heading up the stairs toward Mu Hui's abode. He seems curious about something, calling out to Mu Hui, asking if he's inside. Mu Hui, looking noticeably tired, hears the voice and opens the door, surprising the man. He recognizes him as Mu Cheol, who explains that he came to check on Mu Hui, noting that it's been 3 days since he left the Harmony Medicine Palace, yet Mu Hui hasn't been attending the morning training sessions. Mu Hui, startled, asks if it's really been 3 days. Mu Cheol stands in silence, and Mu Hui reflects on the fact that he hadn't eaten properly for 7 days, which brings to mind his previous experience being trapped in the Blood Tempest sect's inescapable net technique. He says he lost track of time then as well. With that, he suggests they head to the training hall. Mu Cheol agrees, though it's clear he's thinking about something else, commenting that Mu Hui seems different. Mu Hui, undeterred, thinks that a drink would be nice, heading toward the training area. As they approach, they hear a man yelling out skill names and demonstrating them to a group of disciples. Mu Hui watches as the disciples follow the instructor's commands, though they appear to be struggling. One disciple, Mu Ryan, is told to raise his arm higher. He complies, but Mu Hui observes that they're all performing terribly. Their feet move when they shouldn't, their balance is off, and they're unable to generate any real power in their strikes. Their posture is also completely wrong, and overall, they lack the basic skills. Mu Hui acknowledges that the instructor, Mujin, isn't bad and at least seems to know what he's doing. He's the only one who's doing his job correctly. Mu Hui reflects that Mujin is more like the senior disciple of the second generation, though he wonders why Mujin is the one leading the training rather than a senior disciple. It seems the previous owner of his body had a shy personality and lacked martial arts and leadership skills, but Mujin is different. He has the ability to lead, a calm demeanor, and has shown great potential since a young age. Mu Hui thinks it's natural that more disciples listen to Mujin. Talented individuals with the right skills should be given opportunities, and Mujin's personality makes him a more natural fit for the role of senior disciple, at least for now. Mujin finishes the training session, telling the disciples to leave, noting that they all seem particularly beaten today. As they exit, one of them asks Mu Hui if he's feeling all right. Mu Hui replies that he's fine, but another disciple notices that something feels different about him. Mujin then steps down, apologizing for not properly greeting Mu Hui earlier due to the training. Mu Hui tells him it's fine, acknowledging that it must be difficult to handle the responsibilities that should have been his. He then wonders if he's not going to come down the stairs, which might be seen as rude. Mujin, however, just expresses gratitude that Mu Hui is letting him take the lead. Mu Hui then declares that from now on, he'll be taking over the responsibilities. Mujin looks irritated, and one of the disciples asks if she heard correctly. The others seem unsure, but Mu Chiol thinks to himself, remarking that he's not just being sensitive. Something has definitely changed about Mu Hui. Mujin, frustrated, responds that he had given Mujin the task because he didn't have confidence that he could carry it out properly. Mu Hui, smiling knowingly, thinks that he had suspected this all along. He then assumes that Mujin's ultimate goal is to become the head disciple. It is explained that the head disciple's role is one that carries the potential to succeed the sect leader. With the loss of many first-generation disciples due to the Shangxi massacre, the remaining elders are busy with the reconstruction of the sect. It would be far more efficient to guide the second-generation disciples who represent the future of the sect rather than attempting to change the elders or first-generation disciples. Mu Hui also understands that the head disciple is the only one, aside from the sect leader, who can learn the purple aura circulation technique, one of the top 10 techniques for internal energy circulation. To surpass his previous self, Mu Hui needs to master this technique, so he has no choice but to take on the role of head disciple. While it may be shocking, this is the path he must take. Mujin, skeptical, asks if Mu Hui truly believes he is right in this decision. He questions what Mu Hui did the night the Black Knight Palace invaded the sect. Mu Chiol interrupts, shouting Mujin's name as Mujin reminds him that the elders had told him to stay put, but Mu Hui hadn't listened, and the consequences of that night followed. Mu Hui smiles as Mujin continues questioning him, asking if he saved any of the elders or others during the invasion, or if he killed anyone from the Black Knight Palace. Mu Hui shakes his head, admitting that he didn't save anyone. He only managed to burden them in the end. Mujin's expression shifts, realizing what Mu Hui is getting at. He then states that because of Mu Hui's actions, several disciples followed suit, and if the first-generation disciples hadn't risked their lives to protect everyone, many of them wouldn't be here now. Mu Hui agrees, acknowledging that Mujin is right, but Mujin seems annoyed that he's simply accepting the blame without further explanation. Mu Hui then declares that, as the senior disciple, he intends to take responsibility for everything moving forward. Mujin, not entirely convinced, asks how they are supposed to trust him now. Mu Hui, already heading up the stairs, smirks and replies that Mujin is misunderstanding something. When Mujin asks what he means, Mu Hui turns and, glaring at him, asks since when did he need to look up to him. He then asks if it sounds like he's trying to convince Mujin, or if he has to ask for permission in the choices he makes. Mu Hui isn't trying to convince anyone. He's simply notifying them of his decisions. Mujin, clearly surprised, was shaken by the presence of the man in front of him, wondering what kind of person this was. This was definitely not the same senior disciple he knew, and it sent a chill through him. Mu Hui, unfazed, tells him that he'll be taking over the morning training starting tomorrow. If Mujin has any complaints, he should come to see him after the training, but that he shouldn't get too upset about it. Mu Jin is still taken aback, muttering that Mu Hui seems like a completely different person. Mu Hui, still calm, says that people often change when they come back from the brink of death, and it's safe to assume that's what's happened to him. Meanwhile, the other disciples are gossiping about the change in Mu Hui. They overhear Mu Jin's frustration and wonder if Mu Hui really plans to take over the training sessions. Some disciples begin discussing it amongst themselves, with one saying that they heard the same thing. Another adds that Mu Jin was really mad at first but calmed down, though his face looked odd. One disciple expresses concern, mentioning that while Mu Jin might be trying to back down out of kindness, he's still worried, especially knowing the senior disciple's skill level. That night, a group of disciples heads over to Mu Hui's house, knocking on the door. When Mu Hui answers, they ask if they can talk. He responds with curiosity, noting that if they want to talk away from the others, he's eager to hear what they have to say. He tightens his grip on his wooden sword, ready for whatever may come. One of the disciples is surprised to see Mu Hui holding the wooden sword, as it's so unlike him. Mu-san speaks up, saying that he'll get straight to the point. They want him to take back what he said, explaining that Mu Jin only backed off from the discussion because he wanted to help preserve Mu Hui's image. Mu Hui finds this interesting and asks if Mu Jin sent them. They respond that they came of their own volition. Mu Hui nods, still intrigued, but he makes it clear that they have no say in his decisions, and he'll pretend he didn't hear what they said. He suggests they leave. Mu-san calls out to him, asking him to consider their perspective. He tells Mu Hui that it isn't about disliking him. They just want to be taught by someone who is actually skilled. They point out that, right now, Mu Hui's skills are subpar, and this is him being greedy, nothing more. Mu Hui sighs, acknowledging that Manhwa's hierarchy seems to have degraded. He understands their doubt about his skills, so he'll prove himself to them. He tells them to grab their swords. The disciples ask if he's serious, to which Mu Hui replies that he is. He knows how they feel, but if they want to see his skills, they'll have to face him. Mu-san pulls out his blade, declaring that he asked for this, and charges in, warning Mu Hui not to regret it. Mu Hui immediately disarms him, slapping his hand, and then striking him in the chest with the hilt of his wooden sword. The force causes Mu-san to fall to his knees, coughing. Mu Hui glares at the others, and Mu Ho tries to join in, but Mu Hui smacks him in the head with the sword, causing him to fall as well. Mu-san, still confused, tells Mu Hui that he lost, and Mu Hui agrees, adding that now it's time for them to learn a lesson. Mu Ho's leg twitches as Mu Hui asks if they're satisfied with the lesson. The disciples confirm, and Mu Hui reminds them of what he said would happen if anyone tried to gang up on him. They would beat them as well. They acknowledge that, and Mu Hui asks if they still think he's weaker than Mu Jin. They quickly respond that he's much stronger than him, and when he presses them, they admit that Mu Hui is definitely stronger than the other disciples as well. Mu Hui looked at the disciples, noticing that they seemed to have learned their lesson. He decided to forget about what had happened, acknowledging that everyone made mistakes. With morning training approaching, he told them to go get some rest. They thanked him for his mercy and left, with Mu Ho being carried away. Mu Hui watched them leave and then called out, asking someone how long they planned to stay hidden. He told them to come out, and it was none other than Mu Chiol, who seemed surprised and asked how Mu Hui knew he was there. Mu Hui found it amusing that Mu Chiol had tried to hide, given how large he was, and asked him what he wanted. Mu Chiol explained that he had just seen Mu-san and Mu Ho head in this direction. Mu Hui was curious and asked who they were, to which Mu Chiol replied that he had followed them just in case, not expecting Mu Hui to win against them. He added that he didn't think he could defeat them. Mu Chiol then asked if Mu Hui had been hiding his true skills all this time. Mu Hui reflected on his observations of the second-generation disciples, noting two types: those who kept their distance while still respecting him, and those who secretly looked down on him. Mu Chiol didn't belong to either group, as he had often helped Mu Hui, despite his blunt and indifferent personality. Mu Hui thought it had to be because Mu Chiol was worried about him. When he was younger, Mu Hui hadn't understood this, but now he realized that Mu Chiol's actions were driven by concern. Mu Chiol had been worried that Mu Hui might be gravely injured by Mu-san and Mu Ho, which was why he had followed them to ensure he would be all right. Mu Hui decided to make an excuse and said that he wasn't hiding his skills, but had simply reached a new realm of understanding. Mu Chiol, seemingly convinced, asked what he meant. Mu Hui replied that he would explain it during the morning training and suggested Mu Chiol return for now, since it was still a bit early. Mu Chiol agreed and watched Mu Hui head back into his house. As Mu Chiol walked away, he thought about what Mu Hui had said, realizing that the move Mu Hui had used was the six-fold combo sword technique, a beginner-level technique. However, it had been executed in a way he had never seen before, with such beauty and precision that it made him wonder what Mu Hui had truly learned. Mu Chiol, who had always believed Mu Hui was weak, found himself amazed at how much Mu Hui had changed. For the first time, he felt a genuine excitement about morning training. Mu Hui, reflecting on the excuse he had made up on the spot, wondered how he was going to explain himself further. Meanwhile, Mu Ryan asked Mu San and Mu Ho if they really had gotten beaten so easily. They both affirmed, noting that Mu Hui wasn't the same senior disciple they once knew. He had become a different person. Mu San advised caution, explaining that they couldn't act rashly. Mu Ho, still in disbelief, hoped that Mu Hui wouldn't turn against them. Mu Ryan dismissed their concerns, saying they were just talking nonsense, and suggested they prepare for morning training. Mu San, carrying Mu Ho once again, reminded them that they would likely face the consequences if they disrespected the senior disciple. As they walked by, Mu Jin, curious about their condition, asked Mu Ryan if something had happened since they both looked terrible and were limping. Mu Ryan downplayed it, saying it was just about Mu Hui leading the morning training. After a brief explanation, Mu Jin expressed that he understood, but he would have to scold them later. Mu Ryan was puzzled, asking why, and Mu Jin explained that, while he understood that the senior disciple was standing up for himself, it wouldn't be beneficial to act behind his back. He was ashamed of their actions. Mu Ryan, surprised that Mu Jin wasn't taking it well, explained that they were just worried about him. Mu Jin, however, assured him that he understood their concern and would handle it himself. He told them not to worry about it. As they approached the training grounds, Mu Jin's thoughts wandered. He couldn't understand how someone could change so much overnight. He speculated that Mu Hui had been hiding his skills, but it was still hard to believe that he could have injured Mu San and Mu Ho. Perhaps Mu Chiol had helped him, but Mu Jin knew that the truth would soon be revealed. He would be able to tell if Mu Hui was bluffing or not by how he led the training. Mu Hui, now in front of the disciples, began the morning session. He observed that they were all weak and explained that while there were many reasons someone could be strong, there was only one reason for weakness: a lack of the basics. Therefore, starting from that moment, they would focus exclusively on the six-fold combo sword technique during their morning training. The disciples were all taken aback as Mu Hui spoke, assuring them that he knew they were eager to quickly move past the basics and advance to higher-level techniques. Before he could continue, Mu Ryan interrupted, questioning what was wrong with that. Mu Hui, stunned by the interruption, couldn't believe it, and even Mu Chiol and Mu Jin turned around in confusion. Mu Ryan persisted, asking what the problem was with wanting to learn faster, and took it upon himself to suggest that if the others couldn't manage, he would. Mu San, realizing how foolish this was, shook his head. Mu Ryan laughed, dismissing the sect's renown as a joke, calling it a mess. Mu Hui responded, stating that if Mu Ryan had any complaints, he should come up and address him himself. One of the female disciples was surprised, and so was Mu Jin, who began to wonder what the hell Mu Ryan was thinking as he made his way toward Mu Hui. Mu Ryan smirked, explaining that he understood Mu Hui's point, but he wasn't sure if it was a good idea to leave the training in his hands, especially if mastering the six-fold combo sword technique was as important as Mu Hui had claimed. Mu Hui cut him off, unimpressed, pointing out that Mu Ryan's martial arts were lacking. However, since no one else was willing to step up, he would be the one to prove himself. He asked if that was what Mu Ryan was trying to get at. Mu Ryan was silent for a moment before Mu Hui added that he hadn't expected everyone to accept him from the start. He then ordered the disciples to pay attention. From now on, he would not take a single step and would use only the six-fold combo sword technique to block Mu Ryan's attacks. If Mu Ryan's wooden sword touched him, or if he took a step back, Mu Ryan would win. And if Mu Ryan succeeded, Mu Hui would take back his statement about teaching the six-fold combo sword technique and leading the morning training. He locked eyes with Mu Jin as he spoke. Mu Ryan laughed, mocking Mu Hui's confidence, asking if Mu Hui thought his victory over Mu San meant something. Mu Hui didn't respond directly, instead saying that he wasn't sure what Mu Ryan meant, though it did seem like Mu San and Mu Ho had sustained some serious injuries. Mu Ryan jokingly added that Mu Hui shouldn't hate him too much if he ended up losing in front of all the disciples. Mu Hui, serious, replied that he hoped Mu Ryan wouldn't cross that line. With that, Mu Ryan charged, aiming to strike. Mu Hui raised his sword, easily blocking the first attack. Mu Ryan followed with a swift attack from the side, which Mu Hui blocked in turn. Mu Ryan then attempted a feint, but it was no more successful. Every move Mu Ryan made was swiftly blocked by Mu Hui, leaving the other disciples in stunned silence. As Mu Ryan became more desperate, he began thrusting forward rapidly, trying to land a hit. One of the female disciples recognized the movement as the concentrated wind sword, a technique known for its speed. Mu Chiol explained that it was the technique Mu Ryan excelled at, and he had even become faster since the last time Mu Chiol saw him use it. Despite the rapid flurry of strikes, Mu Hui blocked every single one with ease. Mu Ryan was clearly frustrated, and Mu Hui commented that he needed to use more strength in his shoulders when facing him, as he was stronger than the other second-generation disciples. However, Mu Hui also implied that Mu Ryan's skills were still lacking. Mu Ryan, feeling the pressure, began to worry about how to proceed, as he could feel everyone's eyes on him. The disciples murmured among themselves, impressed by Mu Hui's performance. They couldn't believe how much stronger he was than they had initially thought. They noted that his feet had not moved an inch, and his balance was impeccable, making it seem like he had become a different person. Mu Jin, struggling to make sense of what was happening, was in disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Mu Ryan, meanwhile, began to think about what he could do next, realizing that he couldn't recover from this. He had proven the senior disciples' martial arts skills, but not in the way he had hoped. He wondered how Mu Hui had improved so much. Mu Hui, reading his thoughts, explained that it wasn't about being strong. A sword should be swung with the whole body, and the most important part of swinging a sword was using your feet. If one overlooked the importance of the feet, focusing only on the swing, the sword would be useless. Mu Ryan, still trying to grasp it all, thought about what Mu Hui had said. He was beginning to realize that Mu Hui was right, but Mu Hui, sensing his hesitation, pressed on. He said that Mu Ryan probably didn't fully understand, but deep down Mu Ryan was starting to get it. Mu Hui then raised his sword into the air, preparing to demonstrate what it truly meant to swing a sword with the entire body. Mu Ryan, confused, protested, but before he could say anything, Mu Hui moved with lightning speed and smacked him with the sword. On the ground, Mu Jin could hardly believe what had just happened, witnessing the senior disciple had easily subdued Mu Ryan. Mu Hui turned to Mu San and Mu Ho, telling them to come forward and bring Mu Ryan to the Harmony Medicine Palace. They nodded and began running, taking Mu Ryan away. Mu Hui looked around at the disciples, asking what they were doing. He told them that they needed to raise their swords. If they didn't, he would take it as a complaint about his method, and they could come up and voice their objections at any time. Seeing that no one had any complaints, they all got into their stances. Mu Hui, pleased, declared that it was time to officially begin the morning training. As he did, he noticed that Mu Ryan's blood was still on his face. The morning training session spent on Mu Hui instructing the disciples. The scene then shifted to a flashback where Hien asked Hyunjo about his disciple, Mu Hui. Hien was perplexed, calling Mu Hui the worst of them all and questioning if he possessed any hidden talent that Hien had failed to see. He wondered why Hyunjo had chosen Mu Hui as his disciple. Hyunjo, acknowledging that Mu Hui was indeed an ordinary kid, explained that he had never seen him give up on anything in his life. Hien then asked if Hyunjo had chosen Mu Hui purely because of his determination. Hyunjo agreed, but added that the talented disciples had reached enlightenment on their own. However, to create a martial master out of an ordinary person was the duty of a mentor in the essence of martial arts. The flashback ended, and Mu Hui reflected on Hyunjo's words. He admitted that, ideally, he would have picked out only the most talented disciples to train. However, he was no longer the Phantom Swordsman. He was the senior disciple, responsible for leading the second-generation disciples of the Manhwa Sect. He realized that, to fulfill his duty, he had to stick with them until the very end. Mu Hui noted that though he had never properly taught the disciples before, he found that having disciples was far more annoying than he had anticipated. He sighed, joking that if they met again after his death, they would have to buy him a really good drink. Mu Hui glanced at Mu Jin, asking if he was already tired, urging him to put more strength into his movements. As Mu Hui trained the others, his mind wandered to one of his disciples, wondering how he was doing. He knew he had always focused on bettering himself and never teaching others. He couldn't help but wonder if his disciple was even eating properly, but at least he was confident that his disciple wasn't losing any fights. It would be nice to see him again someday. The scene shifted to Mu Ryan, who had a bandage on his head and was now instructed by Mu Hoi to properly train their lower bodies using logs as weights. Although it was a rough path that required starting from scratch, Mu Hoi was confident that, through this trial, the plum flower would blossom. Its scent strong and deep, impossible for anyone to replicate. He too had a long way to go, but his first step in changing the sect was to raise his martial realm. One of the most important aspects of this was sharpening his senses. As the sharper his senses became, the easier it would be to notice small changes in his surroundings, which would naturally improve his martial arts training. Though he hadn't felt much when he first opened his eyes, he could now sense that someone had been watching him. It didn't feel threatening, more like someone was observing him out of curiosity. While he couldn't pinpoint who it was just yet, he was certain that, soon enough, he would be able to tell who they were and where they were. Mu Hoi continued walking through the Crimson Forest, thinking about his path forward, and made his way to a pavilion. He entered the building, where a man named Hyun Gak greeted him, wondering who had come in. Upon seeing Mu Hoi, Hyun Gak asked what he needed. Mu Hoi respectfully greeted Hyun Gak and explained that he had hoped to study the secret techniques. Hyun Gak found this curious, but warned him that his injuries couldn't have fully healed, so he shouldn't overexert himself. Mu Hoi agreed, acknowledging his caution. Hyun Gak then mentioned that he had heard Mu Hoi's disciple had been rather rude to him. Mu Hoi paused, wondering who Hyun Gak was referring to. After thinking for a moment, Mu Hoi recalled that he had beaten 3 different people recently, but it didn't matter who it was. Hyun Gak apologized, saying it seemed like Mu-san had done something to deserve the beating. He also added that, in his time, Mu-san would have faced even harsher consequences, and he was sorry he hadn't taught him better. Mu Hoi reassured Hyun Gak, saying it wasn't a big deal. He had just done what he was supposed to as the senior disciple, and Hyun Gak didn't need to worry about it. Hyun Gak was confused, asking if Mu Hoi had just referred to himself as the senior disciple. He was taken aback and wondered aloud if Mu Hoi's eyes had always been as sharp as they were now. Mu Hoi wondered why Hyun Gak was staring at him so intently, questioning whether he had changed his mind about being upset over the way he had beaten his disciple. Hyun Gak, however, simply remarked that Mu Hoi's eyes were full of determination, noting that it was good to see him taking his role as senior disciple seriously and looking after his martial brothers. He assured Mu Hoi that he didn't mean to keep him there, and that Mu Hoi was free to go on his way. Hyun Gak then began thinking to himself, reflecting on how Mu Hoi had lost his master and been left alone, but had managed to pull himself together. Hyun Gak felt proud to see Mu Hoi picking himself up again, filled with determination. He hoped that Hyun Jo could see it from wherever he was. Meanwhile, Mu Hoi gathered several scrolls and books, placing them on a table to begin reading. As he flipped through each one, he contemplated what the first step in changing the sect should be. The first step, he decided, was to raise his own martial realm. A question lingered: the definition of martial realm. Some might assume it refers to the strength of one's martial arts, but Mu Hoi explained that this was incorrect. Life and death in the martial world were not determined solely by the strength of one's techniques. No one would fight recklessly when the stakes were life and death. What truly mattered was the ability to utilize the martial arts one had learned, combined with quick, precise judgment and the physical capabilities to back it up. For this reason, a martial realm wasn't just about martial arts. It was the mastery of those arts, along with the wisdom and experience to go with them. That enlightenment came through endless contemplation and reflection. This was the definition of a martial realm that he had created when he was Heian, the Phantom Swordsman, and the best swordsman of the unorthodox faction. It was a truth he had reached after years of training, contemplation, and learning all kinds of secret techniques. The first step in raising his martial realm, Mu Hoi concluded, was to understand his martial arts fully. However, he acknowledged that he still didn't truly know what the martial arts of manhua were. But he wasn't going to remain ignorant forever. At this point, there were things he was not yet allowed to read. Books forbidden to disciples to prevent those who were too greedy or curious from foolishly attempting to learn higher-level techniques and ruining their key paths. All sects restricted access to their secret techniques, and manhua was no exception. Hyun Jo had once said that manhua was more lenient compared to others, but still, it was a renowned sect with a systematic approach to martial arts, and their techniques were not difficult to understand. Mu Hoi had already learned the basics, starting with the six-fold combo sword technique, the most fundamental technique. After that, he had mastered 3 more techniques: the concentrated wind sword, the falling plum blossom sword, and the 1,000-cent sword. Once one learned these 3 techniques, they would gain access to the plum blossom sword secrets, which were essential for becoming the best martial artist in Manhwa's sect. Only by mastering the plum blossom sword techniques could one use the sect's signature sword techniques: the 7 deadly plum blossom sword, the 3-edged plum blossom sword, and the lucid plum blossom sword. These skills were the foundation of Manhwa's reputation as one of the 3 most renowned swordsmanship sections. It was said that the best swordsman of Manhwa had mastered more than one of the 3 plum blossom swords. Manhwa reflected that the 6-fold combo sword technique was the root, the 3 techniques that followed were the trunk, and the sword's secrets after that were the branches. Finally, the 3 plum blossom swords were the flowers. A martial artist who delved deep into the sword techniques of Manhwa became part of the plum blossom tree, representing the mastery and strength of the sect. At his current level, Manhwa had only reached the trunk. While he was eager to study the branches and beyond, he needed to acquire the plum blossom sword to do so. This sword was given only to those who had proven their martial mastery, and it was a symbol of the sect's highest honor. Manhwa knew he needed to obtain it as soon as possible. Just then, he heard someone approaching. Baekyu, the sect leader, asked if Manhwa truly wished to learn the plum blossom sword secrets. Manhwa immediately greeted Baekyu, who had come to check on him, as it had been a while since anyone had been in the room so late. Baekyu asked if he was allowed to sit with him. Manhwa, politely allowed, realized that the candles had been lit for him, presumably by Hyungak. Baekyu, noting Manhwa's focus, asked if he had really read all the materials before him. Manhwa confirmed that he had. Baekyu, now aware that Manhwa had been leading the 2nd-generation disciples in the morning training, mentioned that he had heard Manhwa was focusing on the 6-fold combo sword technique again. Manhwa looked at Baekyu and confirmed that everything he had said was correct. Baekyu, still curious, asked why Manhwa had chosen the 6-fold combo sword technique specifically. Manhwa, sensing Baekyu's probing, wondered what exactly he was trying to get at. Baekyu inwardly thinking that when Manhwa had first spoken to him before, he had always hesitated to answer him, even to simple questions. Now, Manhwa was doing things he hadn't done before, and he guessed that these were the kinds of things Baekyu was thinking about. He assumed Baekyu just wanted to check on him, to see if he was truly all right or if he was merely pretending to be fine and overexerting himself in the process. He figured that Baekyu was trying to gauge his well-being, wanting to give the answer he expected. Manhwa, in response, stated that the foundation of the sect was the 6-fold combo sword technique. Baekyu, acknowledging this, agreed. But Manhwa continued, explaining that while the foundation was sound, the 2nd-generation disciples had started off on the wrong foot. However, it was kinder to say that they might as well have never started at all. Baekyu, surprised by the bluntness of Manhwa's words, was taken aback. Manhwa thought that this was likely a good answer. After all, the sect leader himself knew how bad the 2nd-generation disciples were. By thinking these thoughts, Manhwa figured that just the fact they were in agreement on the matter would reassure Baekyu. Baekyu, however, was still in disbelief. He thought to himself that Manhwa's state was much worse than he had imagined. He appeared to be truly broken. Baekyu shook his head, realizing that Manhwa's situation might be more severe than anyone had anticipated. Baekyu silently pondered the child before him, trying to reconcile this figure with the Manhwa he once knew. That boy had been innocent, incapable of speaking ill of others, yet now he seemed like someone entirely different. The thoughts settled heavily in his mind. Something had changed him. Perhaps the Black Knight Palace's invasion, the weight of being the sole survivor, or the lingering guilt over the deaths of his master, the elders, and the 1st-generation disciples. Whatever the cause, Baekyu knew one thing with certainty. He needed to make Manhwa understand that none of it had been his fault. Manhwa continued, as though reading Baekyu's thoughts. All 2nd-generation disciples knew that the 6-fold combo sword technique was well within their grasp, something they had learned early on at the Manhwa sect. But despite their years of practice, their skill with the technique had deteriorated, a result of years spent training without focus. Baekyu listened closely as Manhwa elaborated. The martial arts of different sects and clans in the Jianghu were shaped by their distinct ideologies. These philosophies were embedded in their martial arts, making them more than just techniques. Manhwa went on to explain how each sect's martial school expressed its ideology. He mentioned Wudong's Taiji Fist, Diansong's Sun-Shattering Sword, and Qingqing's Azure Cloud Crimson Dawn Slash, all as examples of how martial arts techniques were a direct reflection of the ideologies of the sects. As Mu Hui spoke, he considered his words carefully. To truly master a martial school's technique was not merely to practice the physical moves, but to understand and internalize the ideology behind them. It wasn't about perfecting a form. It was about embodying the philosophy the martial school represented. Mu Hui's calm, precise explanation reminded Baekyu of Hyunjo. Despite Mu Hui's apparent detachment, Baekyu couldn't shake the feeling that his words were steeped in a depth and conviction reminiscent of his former disciple. Mu Hui then concluded that the second-generation disciples had become overly focused on perfecting the plum flower, an ideal that distracted them from the true purpose of martial training. He explained that it wasn't about forcing the plum flower to bloom, but letting it happen naturally through the process of training and understanding the ideology behind their martial arts. Baekyu nodded in agreement, impressed by the depth of Mu Hui's understanding. The blossoming of the plum flower would come naturally through focused training, not through artificial attempts to make it happen. Mu Hui then shared his plans to continue guiding the disciples in their training with the six-fold combo sword technique. However, Baekyu shifted his question, making it clear he wasn't asking about the disciples. He wanted to know about Mu Hui's path, the one he intended to follow for himself. Mu Hui paused before answering, thinking carefully. He admitted that while he had great respect for the Manhwa sect's martial arts, there were aspects that he found lacking, especially from the perspective of someone who had always prioritized efficiency for survival. His thoughts wandered further. If his own path no longer aligned with Manhwa's principles, it meant stepping beyond the sect's will, a thought that settled uneasily within him. But despite his internal conflict, Mu Hui offered an answer that would satisfy Baekyu's concerns. He intended to fulfill his master's wishes, to walk the same path his master had, and surpass him. That was the duty of a disciple, after all. However, deep down, Mu Hui knew he wanted the freedom to do as he pleased, even if it meant giving Baekyu an answer he was expected to hear. Baekyu's realization struck him. It wasn't Mu Hui's talent that reminded him of Hyunjo. It was his intent to carry on Hyunjo's will. The road ahead would be difficult. Creating new techniques was no small task, but there was something about Mu Hui's resolve that intrigued him. Baekyu's pride in Mu Hui swelled, and he laughed heartily, expressing his happiness at seeing his growth. He was sure that Hyunjo, wherever he was, would be proud as well. Mu Hui simply acknowledged the praise, quietly thanking him. Baekyu smiled contentedly as he thought back to the plum blossoms that had bloomed amidst the snow. Despite their delicate nature, the plum flowers had endured the harshest cold to bloom more intensely than ever. He thought of the ones he had failed to protect on Manhwa. He should have been the one to fall, not them. Even though the plum flowers had fallen, a small bud remained beside them. His thoughts deepened further. His duty now was to nurture that bud and help it bloom. He gazed out the window, watching the moonlight illuminate the night, his resolve firming with every passing moment. He turned back to Mu Hui. There were many flowers on Manhwa, not just the plum flowers, Baekyu remarked. Mu Hui, curious, asked why the plum flowers had been chosen. Baekyu smiled faintly, encouraging him to think about it. There were lessons to be learned, and Mu Hui would understand in time. Baekyu then realized the conversation had gone on long enough. He stood, apologizing for keeping Mu Hui so long. As he made his way, he remembered something important. He turned to Mu Hui, mentioning that there was something he had meant to tell him before he left. Baekyu, reflecting on his own experience, expressed that though he, too, had lost his master, he couldn't claim to fully understand the depth of Mu Hui's sadness. He acknowledged that everyone experiences emotions differently. He continued, explaining that life and death were one, an inevitable cycle where the end of something marked the beginning of something new. It was a natural flow of things. Instead of viewing Hyunjo's death as an ending, Baekyu advised Mu Hui to see it as a new beginning and to think of his actions as a way of celebrating Hyunjo's life. This shift in perspective, he believed, could help ease the grief. He was sure Hyunjo would have wanted Mu Hui to think this way. Mu Hui reflected on the idea of celebrating his master's life. It didn't sound bad at all. He thanked Baekyu for his wisdom, genuinely appreciating the advice. The wisdom reminded Mu Hui of a past memory with his senior when he was Dako Hien. The senior had once commented on his fragility and how he had been young and impetuous then. Hien had been blunt in his response, asking if the senior wanted to die. He had called Hien arrogant and rash, but had added that those very qualities were perfect for training the body. The senior had then proposed a new way to train, something Heian hadn't forgotten. Now Mu Hui was using that very training method. Tying 3 massive logs together, he lifted them using his legs, holding onto a tree branch as he lifted his leg high to train his lower body. The less trained the body, the more effective this method was. Mu Hui thought back to the eccentric old man, the Iron Mountain Fist King. The training method was certainly a brute force approach, but it worked. He hadn't expected that connection to come in handy like this. As Mu Hui lost himself in thought, a female disciple approached him, calling out to him. It wasn't the time to be training, she said. Mu Hui was briefly confused, unsure of what she meant. Brimming with excitements, she explained that the sect leader had ordered him to make a trip down the mountain. The morning had been spent discussing the concerns surrounding the third-generation disciples, and it was already late, so they had to prepare immediately. One of the elders spoke up, noting that they should have taken in third-generation disciples by now, but the Shanxi massacre had delayed their efforts. Baekyu added that they should also consider bringing in disciples from the outer sects, so others would know they were still doing well despite the setbacks. One elder agreed, and Baekyu confirmed the suggestion, seeing the need to reassure everyone. Baekjin raised a question about sending someone to check on the Shanxi outer sect, knowing that an unorthodox alliance or some other evil organization might be eyeing the power vacuum left behind. Baekyu agreed that this couldn't be ignored any longer. He considered how martial halls set up outside the main sect would attract new disciples eager to learn Manhua's martial arts. The massacre had weakened their forces, and the Shanxi outer sect had taken the hardest hit. As they deliberated on who to send, one elder raised a concern about who would go. Baekyu, however, suggested sending a second-generation disciple to give them a real taste of the Jianghu. The elders were hesitant, worried about how unstable the outside world still was. Baekyu suggested sending a few of the most talented disciples, and the idea quickly turned to the 3 flowers. Baekjin sought clarification, asking if Baekyu meant the 3 best disciples. Baekyu then proposed sending Mu Hui as well, certain that Mu Hui would have no problem dealing with the outside world. At first, Baekjin agreed, but then, in surprise, realized that the sect leader had proposed Mu Hui for the task. One elder expressed concern about sending Mu Hui, especially since he had changed a lot in the past month. Baekyu responded calmly, assuring them with a weary yet calming smile that Mu Hui would be fine. Thus, Mu Hui was sent out to see the outside world, and the scene shifted to Pasang City. Mu Hui led 3 other disciples in accordance with the sect leader's orders. The town was small and unremarkable, with little to draw attention except for a simple establishment that sold drinks. Mu Hui couldn't help but think to himself about how mundane the place seemed. However, Manhwa, his fellow disciple, was completely distracted by the sight of a braised chicken, mesmerized by how delicious it looked. She excitedly asked her senior to look at it. Mu Jin, ever the voice of reason, reminded her that they were wearing the Manhwa sect's uniform and needed to behave accordingly. Manhwa acknowledged him, but her attention quickly shifted to the scent of lamb meat a few steps away. Mu Jin had to call her out again. Manhwa, still distracted by the smell of the food, insisted that they look at it, her hunger apparent. Mu Hui noticed her distraction, but before he could comment, Manhwa bumped into a thug on the street. Surprised, Manhwa turned to face the man she had bumped into. The thug stared back at her, and the 4 disciples stood there awkwardly, with Manhwa still startled by the encounter. Mu Jin immediately urged her to apologize, but before he could finish his words, Mu Hui raised a hand to stop him. The thug, sizing them up, asked if they were second-generation disciples of the Manhua sect. He remarked that it must have been their first time in the Jianghu and wondered if Manhua sect didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. Manhwa, still confused, wondered aloud about the thug's words. He went on to say that she should be the one to apologize as she had bumped into him first. The thugs pressed the issue, making it clear they believed Manhwa was at fault. Mu Hui, assessing the situation, realized the thugs must be from some criminal organization, given their appearance. He thought that they had likely taken advantage of the power vacuum left by the Shanxi outer sect. Despite the setback from the massacre, Mu Hui felt that Manhua was not so weak as to allow lowlifes like them to push them around. It was clear that someone influential was backing these thugs. Mu Hui didn't know who, but he wasn't concerned with that. His focus shifted to how this situation would be a valuable experience for the younger disciples. Meanwhile, the thug in the green robe seemed to be fixated on Manhwa's chest, his gaze unwavering as she continued to argue with his companion. Without warning, Hui drew his sword and pointed it at the thug's eyes, asking where he thought he was looking. This caught the thug off guard, and Manhwa was startled by the sudden tension. Hui explained that he had known from the beginning that the thug was the one who had bumped into her, and he had been waiting to see how the situation would unfold. He had seen the thug's arrogance and was now certain that the thug had crossed the line. He warned them that they had just started a fight with the Manhwa Sect. Hui conveyed an understanding of how the Jianghu underworld perceived the Manhwa Sect. The thug's mind raced in response. It was clear that their origins had been uncovered. A silent curse formed in his thoughts as he struggled to comprehend how this realization had come about. Regardless of the method, action was necessary. With urgency, he acknowledged the mistake and sought to rectify it, offering an apology, but Hui rejected the apology, unwilling to accept anything from such scum. With a cold, commanding tone, he told them to leave immediately if they didn't want to risk one of them losing an eye. The thugs, fearing that Hui would follow through with his threat, fled in haste. Manhwa, still rattled, apologized to Hui, but he reassured her, telling her that the thug was in the wrong, not her. Chiol remarked that those from the underworld must be far worse than they had imagined. Hui, sensing the tension, suggested that they find an inn and get something to eat first. This idea brought joy to Manhwa, whose attention was immediately drawn to the food she spotted. On the other hand, Jin remained deep in thought. Jin reflected on the situation. They had been the ones who had picked the fight, yet he had rushed to tell Manhwa to apologize without even realizing that. He had been focused on being careful with their behavior, considering they were representing the Manhwa Sect. But he had failed to recognize the need to address those who had dared to look down on the sect. As Jin pondered, he realized that Hui had already understood the situation. His senior was aware of his surroundings at all times and had reacted as though he was used to handling such things. Jin, now steeling himself, thought that he would never allow anyone to look down on Manhwa Sect again. Meanwhile, Hui regretted not dealing with the thugs more directly, by simply killing them in that moment. But his focus remained on the task at hand. Soon, they arrived at an inn, seated themselves, and prepared to order. When they were done, a mountain of bowls was piled up on the table. Hui, looking at the pile of bowls, teased them, wondering if they had been lazing around with their training since it seemed like she was eating less than usual. Manhwa, quick to defend herself, assured him that she wasn't slacking off. Chiol chimed in, suggesting that Hui simply ate more now. Right after, Manhwa expressed her frustration. It would have been much easier if the sect leader had been more specific with their mission or goal. His instructions had been too vague, leaving them uncertain about what to do next. Hui tried to offer some direction. He spoke if anything noteworthy had happened during the day. Manhwa, still thinking, racked her brain, trying to recall anything important. Some people had picked a fight with them. They had reserved rooms, and then they had eaten. Her thoughts finally led her to the underworld. It clicked in her mind, and she realized the significance of the encounter. Hui then clarified their situation. The sect leader had given them his full trust to make their own decisions. He was considering teaching a lesson to those from the underworld, though he stopped short of saying it outright, instead suggesting they deal with them. He turned to his fellow disciples, asking what they wanted to do. That night, the 3 second-generation disciples decided that their first course of action would be to gather information. Hui, donning a cloak, moved through the night, keeping to the shadows as he witnessed a group of random thugs harassing a young woman. In the dark alleyway, the man from the underworlds placed his arm on the woman, trying to convince her that they were the only ones who asked so little. The term underworlds referred to those who committed immoral acts based on incorrect beliefs or thoughts. While the word might evoke images of demonic forces, like the Black Knight Palace, there was a distinct difference between the underworlds and the various martial artists within the unorthodox, including the demonic forces. The woman trembled in fear as a bald man spoke to her, trying to exclaim something. He mentioned that the calculations were off and pointed out that the interest rate had recently increased, but they had overlooked it. The woman was confused, and the bald man explained that it was only right to collect the money at once. However, since the mistake was his, he suggested that instead of money, she pay with something else. His gaze lingered on her bosom as he spoke. The difference between the underworlds and the various martial artists within the unorthodox was in their goals. The underworlds sought money, pleasure, or the cheap thrill of dominion over the weak. Organizations that killed for money could also be considered underworlds, though they were usually just called assassins. In contrast, the underworld were often seen as thugs and ruffians, living dirty lives and never aspiring to become anything more. However, Hui had not expected them to start a fight upon seeing a disciple from Manhwa. He joined the conversation, calling the man either arrogant or ignorant, though he couldn't fully comprehend their behavior. The thugs turned to him and asked who he was. They complained about being told to stand watch by the bastard Yungbong, who was nowhere to be found. They assumed Yungbong had grown impatient and wandered off like a bum. Hui demanded to know who they thought they were to act in such a manner, questioning if they had some backing. The thugs were confused, thinking Hui was looking for a fight. They threatened him, saying that if he didn't want to get messed up, he should just leave. Hui had other intentions, though. He had come to find them for a different reason. The man told Hui to leave, but the bald man kept his arm on the woman's shoulder, suggesting they continue what they had started. Before the bald man could finish his sentence, Hui's knee struck the other man's face, sending him flying backward. The bald man was left dumbfounded. Hui approached the man on the ground and kicked him again, knocking him unconscious. With the bald man now stunned, the woman escaped his grasp. Hui called the bald man a pig, to which the bald man meekly replied with respectful affirmation. Hui noticed that the men had learned some third-rate martial arts and suggested that the bald man approach him with killing intent. At the very least, that would give him a chance to live. He then ordered the man to hand over his wallet. A few moments later, a man was groggily urinating on a tree when the men at the table called to him, teasing him about pissing all day. One man complained that he'd sober up at that rate. The old man responded, saying that the other man would be coming soon. The groggy man grumbled, having failed to notice the men tied to the branches of a tree. He returned to the table and asked why the other man was rushing to drink. The man explained that he had seen something interesting and wanted to share it. He pointed to the next table, where someone had ordered an enormous amount of food, about 3 bundles worth. However, he was confused because the person was no longer there. He insisted that a man in a cape had been there just moments ago, ordering food to go. Even at night, the streets bustled with people. Manhwa was deep in conversation with a merchant, while Chiol secretly followed some men. Jin, meanwhile, was drinking and eavesdropping but remained focused on his task. In a slum area of the city, the smell of pork belly and spring rolls filled the air. One man commented that he didn't know where the bastard had been rolling around eating, but found it ridiculous that he brought food in front of them. The crowd, unable to resist, decided to go after the man to grab the food. However, Hui drew his sword, pointing it at them. He told them that he wasn't there to share, and that if they dared touch his food, he would cut their heads off. A man stepped forward and, with a respectful tone, said that the young master was impressive. He introduced himself as Jingi of the Beggar Sect. Hui sheathed his sword and introduced himself in turn. Jingi expressed regret that the Beggar Sect could not be of help during the Shangxi massacre, also acknowledging the shame of the incident with the Manhwa sword saint. Hui responded that it was fine and expressed sympathy, understanding that the aftermath of the Shangxi massacre must have been difficult, especially because of the extreme heavenly sect. Jingi acknowledged Hui's knowledge and then asked what had brought him to the Beggar Sect. Hui replied that he wanted to learn more about the underworlders that were currently controlling Pasong. He noted that food would lose its taste once it became cold and suggested they speak while eating. Jingi was amused and took a bite, while Hui learned that the underworld bastards were from the brutal blood faction. They had taken control of the power vacuum left behind by Hua Ryu, Mount Hua's outer sect, which had been annihilated during the Shangxi massacre. Hui was surprised by the strength of these underworld men and asked if it was typical for them to be so capable. Jingi explained that everyone in the brutal blood faction was somewhat knowledgeable in martial arts. Hui agreed, as he had already encountered a few of them and had noticed that they seemed to have learned third-rate martial arts. Shifting the conversation, Hui reminded Jingi that they hadn't yet discussed what truly mattered. Jingi asked what he meant, and Hui revealed that he was referring to the mastermind behind the brutal blood faction. Jingi asked why Hui believed there was a mastermind behind the faction, and Hui explained that while Pasong wasn't a particularly large area, it wasn't small either. The Huaryu sect was quite large for a small to mid-sized sect, and Pasong, being relatively big among smaller places, seemed an unlikely target for a mere underworld organization to monopolize. The power vacuum there would naturally attract interest, and it seemed odd for a single underworld faction to control the area completely. Mu Hui explained that it wouldn't be surprising if dozens of underworld groups controlled different parts of Pasong, competing against one another. Jingi complimented Mu Hui's discernment, noting how it was hard to see him as a mere rising prospect in Jianghu. He then explained that he hadn't brought it up earlier because he wasn't yet certain, but now that Mu Hui had voiced his thoughts, he could share what he knew. Clearing his throat, Jingi told Mu Hui not to be surprised. He revealed that there was a martial artist who was frequently in contact with the Brutal Blood faction, and that they were from the Nine Hellsword Sect. The Nine Hellsword Sect was one of Shangshi's 3 big sects, ranking alongside 2 of the 10 largest sections. Despite their size, the Nine Hellsword Sect had never paid much attention to the Manhwa or Zhongnan sects. This nonchalance and their larger scale made them formidable. Mu Hui found it strange that the Nine Hellsword Sect would be involved. If they were behind the Brutal Blood faction, they would have flaunted their ambitions. But he questioned whether they had the time and ability to focus on an area like Pasong. Jingi clarified that he wasn't certain the mastermind was from the Nine Hellsword Sect. If they were involved, they wouldn't have cared about appearances and would have caused a ruckus. Mu Hui understood there was no concrete evidence, but he still doubted the Nine Hellsword Sect's involvement. Jingi praised his insight, and Mu Hui, now more curious, asked who this martial artist might be. Jingi seemed to have forgotten to mention the name, and then revealed that he suspected the martial artist was the Red Wolf Sword from the Nine Hellsword Sect. Mu Hui was taken aback and clarified, asking if Jingi had just mentioned the Red Wolf Sword. Jingi confirmed and, seeing Mu Hui's reaction, noted that it would have been strange if he hadn't heard of the name. He cautioned Mu Hui to be careful of whatever plans the Red Wolf Sword might be orchestrating. Mu Hui was deep in thought, as he had never heard of the Red Wolf Sword before. At dawn, Mu Hui gazed into the distance, hoping to gather intelligence on the Red Wolf Sword, but he had no success. That night, he continued to accompany Jingi, sharing drinks with him, even if only tea. His plan was to play along for a while and wait for Jingi to open up about the Red Wolf Sword. He intended to drink just enough to coax information from him, but he hadn't accounted for one important detail, which was the drink tasted so good. Jingi noticed Mu Hui's enjoyment and remarked that it seemed to be to his liking. Mu Hui agreed, saying it had been so long since he'd tasted something so fine. Jingi seemed puzzled, as he thought this was Mu Hui's first time in Jianghu. Mu Hui kept drinking, though the beggars knocked themselves out too soon, leaving him unable to drink as much as he wanted. He didn't get the information he sought, but it was fine, since he already had some assumptions about the situation. Even so, he still wondered what choices the underworld men would make. With some time left, Mu Hui decided to enjoy the leftover wine. As night fell, Mu Chiol seemed bothered by a smell, and Mu Hua had an idea that it was alcohol. Mu Hui then spoke up, asking the 3 disciples what they had learned. Mu Hua spotted bottles hidden beneath Mu Hui's bed and couldn't help but ask if he had been sitting there drinking while they were out gathering information. Mu Hui responded that he had not been drinking. Mu Hua pressed further, and Mu Hui stood his ground, insisting that he wouldn't repeat himself. He told them to share what they had learned. Mu Jin spoke first, reporting that the underworlders had taken over the power vacuum left by Manhwa's outer sect and now controlled Pasong. Mu Hua added that the underworld men were a group of evil bastards, dining and dashing, stealing from civilians, and resorting to violence when the people didn't cooperate. It was apparently common for them to beat someone to death. Mu Chiol then spoke up, informing Mu Hui that the biggest problem with these men was that they had learned martial arts. While it was only third-rate martial arts, it was still dangerous when used against civilians who hadn't studied martial arts themselves. Mu Hui praised them for their quick work, considering the little time they had to gather information. Now, it was his turn to share what he had learned. He was certain that the 3 disciples had already cross-checked their findings, but he reaffirmed that the information was true. However, there was something they should be skeptical about, which is how the men had learned martial arts. Mu Hui explained that it wasn't that hard to learn third-rate martial arts, and books on such techniques were easy to obtain. But these men were the type to never touch a book unless it was to burn it. He doubted that all of them had learned martial arts from a book. It seemed unlikely, and someone must have helped them. Mu Hui had looked into who might have assisted them, but although he found out who it was, he couldn't uncover the reason behind it. Mujin asked who it was, and Mu Hui fell silent for a moment before revealing that it was the Red Wolf sword from the Nine Hellsword Sect. Hearing this, the three disciples were shocked. Mujin was surprised to learn that it wasn't just a group of lowly criminals they were dealing with. Mu Hui, thinking of ambushing the underworlders and wiping them out, asked what they thought of that plan. The three were once again surprised. Mujin wondered if Mu Hui was serious, considering the men were tied to the Nine Hellsword Sect. Mu Chiol spoke up, saying he had no idea why the Nine Hellsword Sect would work with a criminal group, but he didn't think it was something they should decide on their own. He suggested that it would be best to report to the elders before making any decisions. Mujin silently cheered for Mu Chiol as he shared the same opinion. Mu Hui simply questioning the suggestion. Manhwa expressed agreement with Mu Chiol's stance, adding that they needed to stand up against the injustice. Mu Hui was amused, while Mujin was internally disagreed. To Mujin, the situation in Manhwa was already overwhelming, recovering from the Shanxi massacre. If they clashed with a large sect like the Nine Hellsword Sect, it could spell disaster for them. Mujin wanted to avoid that at all costs. Finally, Mujin spoke, expressing his concerns that it would be too dangerous. He explained that while it would be fine if they were just dealing with the underworlders, if the Nine Hellsword Sect was indeed behind them, they might be starting a war. Mu Hui assured him that he was jumping to conclusions, but he understood Mujin's concerns. He reassured him that such a conflict wouldn't happen. Mujin asked how Mu Hui could be so certain, and Mu Hui explained that the Nine Hellsword Sect didn't operate like that. He mentioned that the Nine Hellsword Sect was a tyrannical organization, and if they wanted to eliminate a group, they wouldn't go behind the scenes. They would simply start a fight. Mu Hui also pointed out that with Manhua's current situation, the Nine Hellsword Sect could invade and wipe them out at any time if they wanted. However, Mu Hui believed that the Nine Hellsword Sect wouldn't have the time or resources to deal with such matters right now. Mujin was still confused, but Mu Hui concluded that the underworlds were not truly connected to the Nine Hellsword Sect. Even if they were, he didn't believe the Nine Hellsword Sect would initiate a war with Manhwa. Once Mu Hui had finished explaining, he told them that they would be leaving. Mujin panicked and asked where Mu Hui had gotten this information from, and if it was trustworthy. Mu Hui simply with a word of affirmation and revealed that he had gotten the information from the Beggar Sect. Mujin was dumbfounded. The Beggar Sect, for what he knew, was an orthodox organization composed of beggars. Any beggar in Murim could be considered a part of the sect, and in terms of numbers, no organization in Murim could match them. The Beggar Sect used their numerical advantage to gather intelligence, earning money and food by trading information. One should never underestimate them, just because they were beggars, because they had learned martial arts and followed their own morals and ethics. Therefore, any information from this organization was definitely trustworthy. Before they departed, Mu Hui told Mujin not to worry too much. He admitted that he had expressed an intention to kill them, but that didn't mean he wouldn't first try to be peaceful. Mujin convinced himself that he had been overthinking things. He decided to stop worrying since his senior disciple had assured him that things would be worked out. He willed himself to calm down. Mu Hui instructed them to get ready, as they had already arrived. Mujin had no idea what Mu Hui would say to the underworlders, but he knew it would be obvious if he seemed too anxious. He didn't want to be a burden. To his surprise, Mu Hui kicked the door, shattering it. He then questioned aloud where the piece had gone. The underworld men wondered when they saw the gate broken down and demanded to know who the intruders were. Mu Hui casually stated that it was nice to see them all gathered there. He told the men to relay a message to the Red Wolf Sword and their leader, demanding that they show up and kneel in apology. If they did, Mu Hui announced that he would spare their lives. As he spoke, he unsheathed his sword, signaling that things were about to escalate. The men stood there, confused, until one underworld member recognized the symbol. Realization dawned on them, and they understood that the intruders were from Manhwa. Mujin scowled and informed his senior disciple that he didn't think this was a peaceful method. Mu Hui asked what they meant and told them to remember that breaking down the gates was a common approach when ambushing another sect or clan in the Jianghu. Just then, someone from inside the building stormed out, demanding to know what the ruckus was about. A man reported to his leader that the intruders might be from the Manhua sect. The leader stopped in his tracks, eyeing the group carefully. He thought to himself that they were just a bunch of kids, only 4 of them, and wondered if these kids were really so confident just because they came from Manhwa. He finally spoke, asking them if they wanted to die for ambushing them so late at night. The leader decided to let it go for now because they had an important guest. He told the intruders to leave if they didn't want to die. Mu-Hui responded that it was actually they who would die and advised the man to watch his tone, as Mu-Hui didn't like how he spoke. The man was dumbfounded, wondering if this kid was out of his mind. He warned that while he might not know who they were involved with, he saw the kid clearly didn't value his life. The leader told his men to show these newbies how terrifying Jianghu could be, but ordered them not to kill the intruders. The men drew their swords, but the 4 kids from Manhua remained calm. Muhua noticed something that made her expression turn grim. She saw 2 corpses at the back, a man and a woman, both covered in blood. Her anger surged as she moved toward them. The 3 men were surprised by her sudden action. Muhua knelt by the bodies to check them over. The man had died with his eyes wide open, and the woman was gravely injured. Mu Chiol and Mu Jin rushed to her side, yelling for her to be careful with the men in front of her. They raised their swords at her, but Mu Hua, now enraged, swiftly attacked using the bamboo leaf hand technique. The men were thrown back, groaning in pain as they crashed to the ground. Mu Jin and Mu Chiol positioned themselves to cover her back. Mu Jin scolded her for acting on her own, but Mu Hua was determined. She announced that the bodies weren't in a good state and needed to be taken to a physician immediately. The bald man, whom Mu Hua had attacked, retorted, asking who says they can take them. He then stated that while they might be from Manhua, they were weak. He told the underworld men to get them if they could, provided they all fought together. The leader watched the exchange, and Mu Hui observed that while Mu Hua had used less force than usual, it seemed like she was controlling her strength as she did during training. He commented that she was being too soft, then asked if her sword was just for decoration. He pressed her, asking why she hesitated when the men were clearly trying to kill her. He urged her to stab them without further hesitation. The leader, watching Mu Hui remain unfazed as his fellow disciple rushed to help Mu Hua, concluded that this kid must be confident in his skills. He decided not to confront Mu Hui directly, but instructed his men to take care of the others and deal with the kid later with numbers. Mu Hui observed this, confused about the leader's behavior. He wondered why the man was running toward the other underworld men instead of dealing with him directly. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Mu Hui realized that this was the situation he had been hoping for. The 3 disciples were inexperienced in the Jianghu, having only recently joined the underworlds, so they weren't fully aware of what they were up against. Mu Jin, however, was surprised when dirt was suddenly thrown into his face. A kick to the stomach followed, and Mu Hui knew that these men often threw dirt and even spat at their opponents. He was sure the 3 disciples are taken aback by having to fight enemies who were doing whatever it took to try and kill them. It was different from the incident with the Black Knight Palace when the first-generation disciples had been there to protect them. Now, they would die if they didn't take their opponents down themselves. Mu Jin was on the ground when a sword was swung above him. He did his best to block it with his own sword. Mu Hui knew that these 3 needed to learn that in the Jianghu, life and death weren't determined solely by martial prowess. The training they had received up in the mountains, where they merely took turns attacking each other, was far from the reality of what they now faced. It seemed different for Mu Chiol, though. He was calm and didn't hesitate to defeat his opponents. A bald man with a sword rushed toward him. Dropping the man he was holding, the bald man swung his sword, but Mu Chiol grabbed his hand to stop it. With a powerful punch, the bald man fell unconscious. Mu Chiol's eyes were determined, like a beast in battle. When the leader saw this, he rushed back to Mu Hui. He noticed him and remarked that he was wrong. It seemed that the leader thought he could take down the weaker ones first, then team up with the others to deal with the stronger ones. Before the leader could do anything, however, he was buried waist-deep, upside down in the ground. The men saw their leader down and panicked, unsure of what to do, especially now that their opponents seemed far stronger. A long-haired man suddenly appeared and said they could simply pick one of them to fight. He announced that anyone who could kill a Manhua disciple would be given the leader's position. He told the men to stop being dramatic and finish their job. The disciples recognized this man as the Red Wolf Sword, and Mu Hui couldn't help but express that he had been wondering when this man would finally show himself. The Red Wolf Sword seemed amused that they knew him. He said it was an honor for a young disciple of the Manhua Sect to recognize him. But Mu Hoi replied that he had only just learned of him the day before. He insulted the man, saying he didn't care to learn the names of weaklings. The Red Wolf Sword scoffed, stating that a manhua disciple should follow orthodox ways. Yet here was this kid, speaking like a demonic martial artist. He warned Mu Hoi that if he wanted to continue this path, the Red Wolf Sword would make him regret it. The Red Wolf Sword dropped his cup and jumped down from the building, unsheathing his weapon as he prepared for battle. He told Mu Hoi that he would need to give it his all. Mu Hoi simply replied that he wasn't sure if that was necessary and challenged the Red Wolf Sword, asking if he was strong enough to handle it. In an instant, Mu Hoi passed by the Red Wolf Sword, and the man covered his ear, stunned by how quickly Mu Hoi moved. Before he could react, Mu Hoi smacked him on the head, sending him face first to the ground. The Red Wolf Sword used the scabbard of his sword to help himself up, then performed a maneuver and landed on his feet. He was surprised by the kid's speed. He realized that he hadn't just missed the movements. On top of that, he hadn't even seen Mu Hoi's feet move. The Red Wolf Sword watched him closely, now wondering why Mu Hoi wasn't using his sword. The Red Wolf Sword refused to believe that a young kid like this could be at a higher level than him. He thought there had to be something more to Mu Hoi, but still, there was no special reason why he wasn't killing the old man. He simply wanted to see his swordsmanship against another martial artist. It had been a month since Mu Hoi had respawned in his new body, and he hadn't missed a single day of training. His research into combining Manhua's martial arts with his techniques was continued. However, he couldn't prove the results of his work yet, as the disciples weren't strong enough to see the difference, and neither the elders nor the first-generation disciples had time for him. That was why the Red Wolf Sword was valuable to Mu Hoi. The Red Wolf Sword attacked again, but Mu Hoi simply stepped aside to avoid the strike. Then, with open palms, he used the bamboo leaf hand technique. The Red Wolf Sword flew backward, but Mu Hoi wasn't done. He struck the old man with his sword, sending him reeling. The Red Wolf Sword was dumbfounded. He wondered if Mu Hoi had read his movements. After all, for a kid to be at the level where he could follow someone's steps with such subtlety, it had to be due to a huge difference in their levels. The Red Wolf Sword refused to believe it, but after a brief moment, he acknowledged that the kid wasn't just a talented young prospect. He apologized for underestimating him and decided to go all out. He rushed toward Mu Hoi with renewed resolve. Mu Hoi noticed something approaching, as if a large golden mystic beast charged toward him. The three young disciples turned, worried for their senior disciple, looked on with concern as they prepared for what was to come. Mu Hoi gripped his sword and slashed at the beast using the falling plum blossom sword technique. The beast vanished into thin air. He remarked that the red bud sword technique was fierce, but had many gaps, noting that based on Red Wolf Sword's movements, he hadn't even fully mastered it. Red Wolf Sword was surprised that Mu Hoi knew about the red bud sword technique. He asked how Mu Hoi had learned of it, but before he could get an answer, Mu Hoi charged forward. Red Wolf Sword barely saw him coming and was momentarily confused, thinking he had blocked the attack. He initially considered that it might be an illusionary sword attack, but then he doubted that, although perhaps it was the rapid sword technique. In the blink of an eye, Mu Hoi's slash passed through him. He didn't even have time to realize it before his blood began dripping onto the ground. Everyone was stunned. Not only had blood spilled, but Red Wolf Sword's long hair was cut, leaving only bangs on his left side. The attack also had cuts on his cheek and ear. Red Wolf Sword realized that in that brief moment, Mu Hoi had purposely shifted his sword to avoid killing him. He understood that Mu Hoi could have killed him easily, but had chosen not to. This realization made him wonder why Mu Hoi had shown such restraint. He thought back to how Mu Hoi had stayed behind him, never using his sword to strike directly. It was as though Mu Hoi was going easy on him, and he couldn't understand why. Red Wolf Sword, feeling a surge of frustration, acknowledged that Mu Hoi's talent was undeniable. He thought about how Mu Hoi seemed to be the same person he had in his mind, someone with immense potential. He cursed the meaning of talent, feeling resentful that Mu Hoi was better than him, especially since he had lived at least twice as long as this young man. He cursed Mu Hoi and warned him not to look down on him. He claimed he was a martial artist of the 9 Hellsword Sect and released 3 golden beasts, all of which charged straight for Mu Hoi. Mu Hoi swung his sword, and in a single movement, the beasts vanished. Moments later, Red Wolf Sword was struck by something resembling wind blades. Mu Chiol, watching in awe, recognized the move. Red Wolf Sword bled from several wounds, his body shaking with disbelief. He thought about how he had trained continuously since the kid, not even born, perfecting his martial arts so that his skills would be acknowledged. He questioned how this young man could destroy the results of his decades of effort so easily. He couldn't understand why he couldn't follow Mu Hoi's movements or even cut him. In a moment of frustration, Red Wolf Sword screamed, wondering why his efforts weren't being recognized. Mu Hoi, unfazed, simply cut him down further. The man who had been buried earlier by Mu Hoi regained consciousness, lifting his head from the hole. He coughed and spit out dirt, complaining about the pain in his head. He remembered brandishing his sword just before everything went black, then heard Red Wolf Sword's frustrated cries about his efforts being unacknowledged. Glancing behind him, he was shocked to see Red Wolf Sword stood, right at the moment Mu Hoi struck him. Red Wolf Sword kept thinking that there was nothing more unfair than talent. His efforts had been trumped by the innate abilities of a young prospect. The young man had only trained for a few years at best, yet he had already surpassed him. Even though Red Wolf Sword was on the ground, bleeding from his shoulder, he muttered bitterly about the young prospect and the martial artist from the Nine Hell Sword Sect. He chuckled, acknowledging that it must be nice for Mu Hoi to have the talent to surpass him. Mu Hoi was confused by the man's words, but didn't waste time pondering them. Red Wolf Sword continued, saying that he had seen many talented and young martial artists and could tell that Mu Hoi had grown used to being praised by those around him. He added that it must be nice to cut him down and gain honor from it. Red Wolf Sword warned Mu Hoi to enjoy it while he could, because once the Nine Hell Sword Sect confirmed his death, it would only be a matter of time before he met the same fate. No matter how talented Mu Hoi was, he could never stand against the Nine Hell Sword Sect. Mu Hoi commented dryly that for someone about to die, Red Wolf Sword sure had a lot to say. He kicked Red Wolf Sword, knocking him onto his back, then noted how the man had spoken with a tone of inferiority. As Mu Hoi looked closely, he noticed something. Letters were inscribed on Red Wolf Sword's chest. Mu Hoi realized that Red Wolf Sword was part of the Otherworld unit of the Nine Hell Sword Sect. In the Nine Hell Sword Sect, one could identify which unit a person belonged to by the letters on their chest. The Otherworld unit, the Hell unit, and the Despair unit were considered the three axes that supported the sect, though that term was only used by outsiders who didn't fully understand the internal structure. Mu Hoi knew that the Otherworld unit had not earned any merits and had been completely pushed aside in the competition for succession. The true power lay within the Hell and Despair units, which were at war with the brutal dragon faction. Mu Hoi found it strange. He wondered why the Nine Hell Sword Sect, which was at war with the hidden dragon faction, suddenly had its eyes on the south of Shangxi. After thinking for a moment, he figured out the mission of the Otherworld unit in this war, which their task was to protect the headquarters and provide rear support. However, the Otherworld unit, hungry for merits, had pretended to fulfill their duties on the outside while actually being involved in their dealing to line their pocket. Red Wolf Sword asked how Mu Hoi knew this, but Mu Hoi simply replied that he knew Red Wolf Sword assumed the Otherworld unit would step in for him if he died. Unfortunately for him, the Otherworld unit would do nothing but hide his death at all costs. Mu Hoi told him that instead of supporting the war, Red Wolf Sword had been up to something else entirely. He pointed out that this situation provided the perfect opportunity for the Hell unit and the Despair unit to strike the Otherworld unit down. Even if the Otherworld unit came for revenge at Manhwa, Mu Hoi asked Red Wolf Sword if he thought he would be scared of them. Mu Hoi continued, stating that even the Hell and Despair units wouldn't be enough to face him, let alone the Otherworld unit. It was him who had faced the Nine Hell Sword Sect alone. Red Wolf Sword's eyes widened, realizing that his fate was sealed. The leader, who had been watching this, decided to bury his head back in the ground, trying to convince himself that he hadn't seen anything. But someone grabbed him. Mu Hoi pulled him out and asked why he was still lying down. He ordered the leader to deal with the situation immediately. The leader, nervously, replied with a single word of affirmation. Several books were scattered on a desk. Mu Hoi browsed through them, noticing entries detailing protection taxes, gambling den income, and lists of people who had borrowed money, along with the amounts they owed. He observed how well the leader had kept track of the financial flow. The underworld men sat on the floor, while Mu Chiol stayed at the back, guarding them. Mu Hui asked if this was all the leader had, and the leader confirmed. Mu Hui then told them that the money they had taken and extorted from others would be returned to its rightful owners. Additionally, they would shut down the gambling den, and the underworld men had to finish the job by the end of the day. He asked if there were any complaints. The leader expressed that completing all of this would be difficult. Mu Hui looked unimpressed, and the leader decided not to argue further. Mu Hui clarified that his decision not to kill them wasn't out of mercy. He described the men as trash who didn't deserve to die, but if they did, there would be no one left for the victims to direct their anger toward. He told them not to think they could atone for their actions through death, as their sins were heavier than death itself. It was only right for them to live and atone for the rest of their lives. He asked if they understood, and they bowed their head in affirmation. Mu Hui instructed the faction leader to stay, while the others should start moving. They needed to act swiftly to complete everything by the end of the day. He told Mu Jin, Mu Chiol, and Mu Hua to ensure the underworld men were tearing things down and returning the money. Mu Hua then inquired about what Mu Hui planned to do. Mu Hui simply replied that he had something else to take care of. Mu Hua asked if Mu Hui was going to go drinking again like last time. Mu Hui, with a slight grin, responded with a question of his own, if it looked like he was the kind of person who could drink any time. Mu Hui reminded her to keep an eye on the underworlds, to which Mu Hua assured him that they would be fine. Mu Hui noted that Mu Hua was quicker to catch on than he had expected, but this time, he wasn't going to ask for alcohol. The leader, still shaken, asked why Mu Hui wanted him to stay. Mu Hui told him not to try to hide anything, as he could clearly smell what was going on. He ordered the leader to take him to where the tuber fleece flower was located. Mu Hui, recalling that in his past life, remembered the time he had searched for rare opportunities to grow stronger. He didn't have a sect to support him, so to obtain elixirs, he needed a vast amount of money. Lacking the funds, he searched for rare ingredients on his own. Of course, these were hard to find for a reason, and they couldn't be acquired by simply looking. One day, while resting after training, he had stumbled upon the tuber fleece flower, which had taken 7 years wandering to find. The smell was bitter, with a dull, earthy scent, the one he could never forget. The leader led Mu Hui down a passage, and as they descended the stairs, the scent of the tuber fleece flower grew stronger, signaling that they were close. The leader explained that it was a 200-year-old tuber fleece flower they had obtained by accident and had been storing ever since. He admitted that he had forgotten about it due to the chaos, but didn't expect Mu Hui to recognize it by its scent. The leader praised Mu Hui for his sharp senses and added that the Red Wolf sword had originally planned to take it, but now it had found a master more suited to it. Mu Hui praised the leader for his good work and instructed him to go back to his tasks. He locked the door behind him, the tuber fleece flower now within his reach. Most organizations or forces capable of martial arts have a space where they can practice energy circulation. The iron doors and thick stone walls were solid, leaving Mu Hui with no reason to worry. In his past life, he had consumed a 300-year-old tuber fleece flower. While a 200-year-old one wouldn't be as potent, it was still incredibly valuable. When he opened the box to enjoy it, he was taken aback. He exclaimed in surprise, noticing that this 200-year-old tuber fleece flower was far larger than the 300-year-old one he had eaten in his past life. He speculated that the tuber fleece flower must be at least 400 years old. The one he had found in his previous life had been exceptionally difficult to obtain, so he hadn't expected to find such a rare one so easily. As Mu Hui swallowed it, he felt something was off about ingesting it by himself. He decided that the next time he found something good, he would share it with others. Some time passed. The leader sensed something, an unsettling tremor occurred, almost like an earthquake. He looked around, then peered out the window. Dust covered the area, and eventually a man stepped out. It was Mu Hui, looking refreshed. The leader rushed to him and reported the strange noise, but Mu Hui dismissed it as unimportant. He then asked the leader if he really had time to stroll around. He questioned whether the leader had thoroughly checked the ledger, to which the leader responded that he had been doing so until he had to come down. Mu Hui told him he would check it later to ensure the money had been returned, urging him to do it properly. The leader wished him a safe trip, but once Mu Hui left, he muttered under his breath, calling him a bastard and complaining about his rude manner. Putting that aside, the leader found himself curious about the noise, especially considering the condition of the building. However, he didn't pay it much mind since the building was bound to be destroyed regardless. He couldn't help but wonder what effect the tuber fleece flower had on Mu Hoi to cause such a disturbance. The building was in disarray, with parts scattered everywhere. The underworld men looked exhausted. Mu Chiol approached the leader and reminded him that the sun was about to rise. He asked if the leader really had time to rest. The leader stood up, replying that he didn't. Manhwa also instructed the rest of the men to hurry and tear the buildings down since daylight was fast approaching. Meanwhile, a box filled with silver was opened. The recipient could hardly believe it, and the underworld men bowed down, explaining that it was the money they had unfairly extorted from him, so it was only right for him to take it. He apologized profusely. Someone had been spying on them. It was Jingi, who hadn't expected Mu Hoi to defeat the Red Wolf Sword and handle the brutal blood faction so swiftly. It had only been 2 days since he provided Mu Hoi with information, and now, witnessing the aftermath, he realized Mu Hoi was no ordinary person. To Jingi, it seemed like Manhwa was hiding a dragon. Mu Hoi appeared behind him and casually uttered a greeting. He explained that he came to have a drink because he was feeling a little peckish but realized it wouldn't be fun to drink alone. He added that the alcohol and refreshments were ready and asked Jingi what he thought. Jingi was puzzled, noting that it was still too early in the morning. He commented that the young master seemed to know how to drink, but he agreed to join him. Once they were seated at the table, Mu Hoi asked Jingi what he was curious about. Mu Hoi knew that Jingi already knew about the events, but still, he shared that the Red Wolf Sword was dead and the brutal blood faction was being dealt with. Mu Hoi had already returned the funds to their rightful owners, but the problem remained with the Underworlders. They had become Underworlders out of necessity, with no other way to survive or make a living. Mu Hoi expressed his desire to rehabilitate them, to use them for the reconstruction of Pasung. He then asked Jingi if he knew anyone who could take them under their wing and provide them with work. Though they were possessed martial arts, Mu Hoi reassured Jingi not to worry. He was thinking of severing their dantian while he was there for 3 days. Jingi replied that severing dantian was not so easily done. He was surprised once again by Mu Hoi's words, but assured him that he knew a few merchants. He also reassured Mu Hoi not to worry about the Underworlders, promising to check on them from time to time to ensure they were learning trades and not causing problems. Mu Hoi thanked him, and Jingi replied that it was they who should be thanking him for the opportunity to help. Jingi then changed the subject, asking how long Mu Hoi planned to stay in Pasung. Mu Hoi replied that he still had 2 outer Sect divisions to visit. He needed to see them within a fixed time frame, so he would be in Pasung for 3 days. He then brought up that he had heard there were some strongholds near Pasung and inquired if Mu Hoi planned to deal with them as well. Under the night sky, the streets were bustling with activity as Mu Hoi set a drink down on the table, praising the 3 disciples for their excellent work. Mujin, curious, asked what the bottle was for, to which the 3 disciples looked surprised. Mu Hoi explained that the bamboo leaf liquor had been prepared as a way to celebrate their successful completion of their first real mission. Mujin, however, replied that they did not drink. Mu Hoi nodded in understanding, recalling that in their sect, alcohol was not consumed casually. It was only for special occasions, like the end of the year or to mark significant achievements. He then added that new prospects to the Jianghu die the most during their first real mission. He was certain that the 3 disciples had felt the weight of that truth. He continued, noting that while the martial arts of the underworld were weak, their intentions were clear. The men had charged with the intent to kill, and the 3 disciples had not been prepared to harm them. Mu Hoi stressed that this was the reality of the world outside. Despite their superior martial skills compared to the underworld, the difference between life and death wasn't always determined by one's abilities alone. Mu Hoi pointed out that many newcomers to the Jianghu overlooked this fact and paid a terrible price for it. Yet, these 3 disciples had made it through unscathed. This alone was worth celebrating, and with that, Mu Hoi insisted they drink. Still unsure, Mujin asked if it was also Mu Hoi's first mission. Mu Hoi chuckled, admitting that it indeed was. The 4 disciples raised their cups, congratulating themselves for having completed their first mission safely. The bamboo leaf liquor was surprisingly smooth, and Mujin remarked that it didn't taste bitter, which Manhwa readily agreed with. She added that if all liquor tasted as good, she could easily drink herself silly every day. However, Mujin warned her not to overdo it. Meanwhile, Mu Chiol remained silent, deep in thought. His mind drifted back to the fight with the Red Wolf sword. The technique Mu Hui had used didn't resemble the manhua swordsmanship he was familiar with. He couldn't shake the curiosity about what it truly was. Unable to hold back, Mu Chiol finally expressed his thoughts to Mu Hui, asking about the sword technique he had witnessed. He explained that while Mu Hui's technique had initially seemed like manhua swordsmanship, the moment he deflected the Red Wolf sword strike, the style had transformed into something entirely unfamiliar. The power was concentrated, and the sword's curves lacked their usual fluidity. Mu Chiol wished to understand more about this unique form of sword manipulation. Mu Hui was amused, considered how they had been focused on dealing with the underworld, but hadn't realized he was also being observed. He noted that the technique he used did indeed contain the principle of weight. This was part of the Donko sword technique he had created in his past life. He had incorporated the concept of weight into the basic movements of the six-fold combo sword technique. He was surprised that Mu Chiol had noticed it. Mu Hui acknowledged that Mu Chiol had also recognized the differences in the technique, but had not been able to pinpoint its origin. He had planned to explain it eventually, but now was not the right time. He told the group that before they could discuss it further, there was something else they needed to address. He asked if they had finished their drinks, encouraging them to do so, as they would not have time to drink for the next 3 days. Elsewhere, a carriage moved through the night, traveling along a forest path. Suddenly, someone emerged from the bushes and commanded the coachman to stop. The coachman asked what the matter was, but the man simply threatened him, demanding everything they had or facing death. From a distance, Mu Hui and the 3 disciples observed the scene. Muwa quickly deduced that the men were bandits. Mu Hui explained that these men hid in the forest and waited for travelers to rob. They were part of a larger group, but were not typical underworld criminals. The major difference was that they had learned martial arts and operated more systematically. While the previous group they had encountered had also practiced martial arts, their training had been for specific, targeted purposes, making them different from the usual underworld figures. These bandits, on the other hand, were more organized and posed a greater threat. Mu Hui warned the disciples that if they encountered such bandits, they should assume a stronghold was nearby. From what he knew, there were at least 5 such strongholds around Pasong, though he wasn't certain of their exact locations. One thing was clear, however, these bandits were stronger than those under the Red Wolf sword. Mu understood, but she couldn't help but ask why Mu Hui was sharing this information with them. Mu Hui responded that for the next 3 days, they would be eliminating all the strongholds. One disciple would handle each stronghold while the others observed. The 3 disciples were surprised, and Mu Hua, clearly nervous, stammered as she asked why Mu Hui had made that decision. She wondered if it was because they had done something wrong. Mu Hui, puzzled by her question, asked what she meant. He reminded them that they had nearly died during their last encounter because they hadn't been prepared to take down the underworld members. He clarified that the task he had given them was meant to prepare them for such situations, where they might have to harm others to survive. The weight of his words finally sank in. Mu Chiol agreed with Mu Hui, acknowledging that they could have died if it hadn't been for the senior disciple's intervention. He believed that the mission was a good way for them to learn. Mu Jin, still uncertain, asked how Mu Hui had prepared himself to harm others. Mu Hui struggled with the question, as he knew this wasn't his first real fight, but he couldn't share that with them. Instead, he recalled his first real battle happened so long ago, but still vivid in his memory. He had been young and severely injured. He could remember the fear he felt, the fear that if he didn't kill, he would be the one to die. Mu Hui explained that he had been afraid of dying and, more so, afraid that the other disciples might get hurt. That fear drove him to slay the enemy before him, ensuring that his worst fears didn't come true. Mu Jin listened intently, and Mu Hui added that his words were just a reference. Every fighter had to find their own path to battle. He then turned to Mu Chiol and brought up the topic of the sword technique Mu Chiol had observed. He promised that he would teach Mu Chiol the technique depending on his performance during the stronghold mission. As a start, Mu Hui had planned to demonstrate how to eliminate a whole stronghold, and now was the time to show them how it was done. He instructed them to watch closely. The bandit was soon buried upside down in the ground, with the coachman expressing his thanks to the young martial artist. Mu Hui yanked the bandit from the hole and slapped him across the face. The bandit, bruised and battered, pointed toward his base, where armed men awaited. The men, clearly annoyed, were swiftly defeated by Mu Hui in a blink of an eye, leaving them unconscious on the ground. It was swift. Mu Hui had single-handedly taken down all the thugs. Thus began the 3 days of intense training. During the day, the disciples kept watch over the brutal blood faction, while at night, they handled the strongholds. The training was difficult at first, as everyone hesitated. Manhwa almost got slashed in the process. But soon, the disciples started to gain confidence, learning to act more quickly in response to danger. The hesitation that had once plagued them began to fade, much sooner than Mu Hui had anticipated. They were all performing well against the strongholds, though Mu Jin still struggled a bit. It wasn't that he was lacking in skill. In fact, he was better than both Mu Hua and Mu Chiol in terms of technique. However, Mu Jin hesitated to kill, even when facing certain death. It became clear to Mu Hui that Mu Jin was more afraid of harming others than he was of dying. Having watched Mu Jin closely, Mu Hui understood the root of the problem, but he knew that Mu Jin had to overcome it on his own. With that, Mu Hui informed the disciples that they had completed all the stronghold missions ahead of schedule. It had only taken 2 days instead of the expected 3. He praised them for their hard work and announced that they would leave for Weinan as planned, advising them to rest until the following day. Curious, Manhwa asked what they would be doing that day. Mu Hui replied that he would fulfill his promise to Mu Chiol and teach him a new technique. Manhwa inquired if the rest of them would be included as well. Mu Hui confirmed that they would all participate, as it would benefit them too. Not enthusiastic, Manhwa had hoped for a break, but expected Mu Hui to push them further instead. Mu Hui gripped his sword and, with a single fluid motion, made a large slash that left a dent in the ground. The 3 disciples were left speechless. Mu Hui explained that what they had just witnessed was Manhua's 6-fold combo sword technique, modified by adding more weight to each strike. Mu Chiol, intrigued by the concept of weight, asked Mu Hui to elaborate. Mu Hui explained that the traditional Manhua sword techniques allowed the practitioner to proceed to the next move, even if the sword path was blocked or destroyed. This was partly due to the many variations in the movements, but also because there was no distinction between offense and defense in the 6-fold combo. The technique was fluid, linking together offense and defense seamlessly. Mu Hui went on to explain that, moving forward, he would be teaching them his personal interpretation of the 6-fold combo, with elements of illusion and change added to the technique. Mu Chiol, finally starting to grasp the concept, was eager to learn more. Mu Hui assumed that the 3 disciples were aware he was referring to the Manhua sword saint. He knew that Master Zhou wasn't the first to create such a technique, but as far as Mu Hui was concerned, Master Hyun Zhou was the best at it. That also meant that Master Hyun Zhou possessed a profound understanding of martial arts. Mu Hui explained that Master Hyun Zhou had spent considerable time thinking about the 6-fold combo sword technique. He had concluded that the flamboyant change, even the plum blossom, were all variations of the 6-fold combo, just different branches of the same technique. Mu Hui revealed that Master Hyun Ho had been quietly working on creating a new technique, one that involved the weight of the sword, much like Mu Hui had demonstrated. He shared that the technique was incomplete and, on top of that, Manhua didn't have a system that deeply explored the concept of the sword's weight. Learning an unfinished technique when a solid foundation already existed could be seen as foolish or even wrong. Mu Hui explained that Master Hyun Zhou had kept his work a secret because he understood the dangers of an incomplete technique. He asked the 3 disciples if this was truly the technique they wanted. After considering the question, Mu Chiol looked determined and responded affirmatively. He requested Mu Hui teach him the technique. The training began that same night. By the time the sun rose, Manhwa already had dark circles under her eyes. She couldn't help but wonder how long they were expected to keep watch. She turned to Mu Jin and suggested they go for a run. Meanwhile, Mu Hui was explaining to Mu Chiol that Mu Chiol had been wielding his sword using the principle of illusion. He told him to forget everything he knew about that principle and focus on understanding the principle of weight. Mu Hui explained the difference in how they should use the sword, and Mu Chiol, concentrating hard, tried his best to follow. Meanwhile, Manhwa and Mujin walked away. Manhwa suggested they go observe the underworld members and rest afterward. Mujin agreed, and they headed off. At a nearby building, a man yelled at a servant, complaining that he wasn't getting anything done at a slow pace. The servant approached the man and explained that his back and stomach had been aching since the day before. Manhwa, observing the situation, realized that Mu Hoi's words about those who joined the underworld out of necessity being more motivated when given the opportunity were true. Manhwa had once considered them nothing more than trash, but now she saw that, even if they were aware she was watching, their inability to use martial arts made them far less threatening. She assumed Mujin was also keeping an eye on the underworld somewhere, so she decided to head back and rest. She felt content, knowing she had done what was necessary, and planned to rest well after the intense training. As Manhwa walked, a woman approached her. Manhwa immediately became alert, but was taken aback when she saw the woman had a bruised eye and couldn't even open it fully. Manhwa recognized her from their previous encounter with the brutal blood faction. The woman apologized for startling Manhwa, explaining it wasn't her intention. Then Manhwa noticed the young girl the woman was holding. The woman introduced her younger sister, Young. Manhwa swiftly sheathed her sword and asked the woman how her wound was. The woman explained that she was a bit sensitive due to overwork and thanked Manhwa for saving her. Manhwa, feeling a warm surge of gratitude, blushed, feeling good about the situation. It made her wonder if this was why chivalrous fighters existed. The woman shared that her wound had healed quickly, and thanks to Manhwa, they had been able to carry out their father's funeral. Manhwa was confused for a moment before recalling the man who had died with his eyes open. She apologized for not being more helpful earlier and hoped their father could rest in peace. The woman reassured her, saying she hadn't mentioned it to receive any pity. Instead, she was thankful that Manhwa had saved her, so that her sister, Young, would not be left alone. The young girl blushed and, with great sincerity, expressed she wanted to become an impressive chivalrous fighter like Manhwa when she grew older. Overcome with emotion, Manhwa was about to burst into tears. Confused, the woman wondered why Manhwa was crying. She asked the little girl if her name was indeed Young and told her that she could achieve her dream. Young asked if it was true, and Manhwa assured her that she could even become greater than herself. Manhwa continued to cry, and the woman became flustered, asking if Manhwa was injured. Manhwa replied that it wasn't that. As dusk fell and the night sky appeared, Mujin sat in a room, brooding with a grim expression on his face, lost in thought. The next day, Manhwa was irritated when she saw Mu Hoi walking quickly, clearly in a hurry. She asked him why he was rushing, wondering what had caused the sudden urgency. Mu Hoi was confused. He told Manhwa that he wasn't rushing, but rather, it was her who was moving too slowly. He asked if she had become lax after just one day of rest. It seemed to him that she had been slacking in her usual training, so he decided to keep a closer watch on her. Manhwa complained, saying they should have left earlier, questioning why they had even rested for a day. Mu Hoi glared at her, and immediately she stopped complaining. Mujin, noticing the tension, wondered if the underworld members in Pasung were rehabilitating properly. From their observation, there didn't seem to be any issues, but Mujin fell silent when he saw the senior disciple's grim expression. He quickly changed the subject, and Mu Hoi assured him that there was no need to worry. The beggar sect would continue to monitor the underworld members. What the disciples needed to focus on, Mu Hoi explained, was strengthening their mentalities. He considered increasing the difficulty of their training to push them further. Mujin realized that he had failed to change the topic, and both he and Manhwa shared a similar thought, that they were likely meeting their end soon. Out loud, Manhwa expressed that she missed Young. Mu Hoi, now curious, asked about her. Manhwa explained that Young was the younger sister of a girl she had saved during the brutal Blood Faction's attack. Manhwa recounted meeting the girl while watching the underworld members and how the little girl had told her she wanted to become an impressive chivalrous fighter when she grew up. Mu Hoi, feeling an unusual sense of nervousness, realized it was the first time he had ever worried about a young child's future. Manhwa realized Mu Hoi was teasing her. Just then, Muchiel noticed Mu Hoi had stopped walking. Mu Hoi announced that they had arrived in Wainan. He was glad they reached their destination before sunset. Mujin pointed out that there was a sect called the Fresh Flower Sect in Wainan. Mu Hui decided that they would have dinner there, and Manhwa was enthusiastic about the idea. Mu Hui, however, teased her once more, bringing up her earlier complaint about his speed. At the Fresh Flower Sect, a commotion broke out. A kid punched a gray-haired boy, causing him to fall into the arms of another bully. The one who punched told the others to hold the boy down while he struck him again. The gray-haired boy winced in pain. Just as the bully raised his fist for another blow, his hand was stopped by someone. The figure, Mu Hui, observed that the child had been using quite a bit of internal energy for such an act. The kid glanced around nervously and saw more men in black uniforms appear. The gray-haired boy recognized the clothing, that they belonged to disciples of the original Manhwa sect. Mu Hui spoke, telling the bully that his actions could have killed a child who hadn't learned martial arts yet. He glared at the bully and pointed out that he must have known the danger of using such force. The bully shot him an arrogant glare, and Mu Hui noticed the child's arrogance despite his youth. He quickly realized that the issue lay with the child's upbringing. Mu Hui understood that the child had simply been influenced by his parents, and the child himself was not entirely at fault. The bully continued to glare at Mu Hui, prompting him to threaten the boy. He warned him that if he kept glaring at someone while knowing he was wrong, he might end up getting slapped in the face. Mu Hui noted that the boy seemed to be part of an orthodox group, so he asked if the sect had taught him to behave in such a manner. Before he could finish his sentence, a small hand tugged at his shirt. The gray-haired boy had moved in front of the bully, as if to protect him from Mu Hui. Mu Hui watched the exchange for a moment before stepping back, releasing the bully and instructing them to leave. The bullies quickly retreated. The gray-haired boy, offering a fist-palm salute, introduced himself as Lim Sanha of the Fresh Flower Sect. He thanked Mu Hui for his help. Mu Hui introduced himself as a second-generation disciple of the Manhua sect. Concerned, Manhwa asked the boy if he was all right. Sanha confirmed he was fine. Mu Hui inquired about the identity of the bullies. Sanha explained that the kid was the young leader of the Great Truth sect, and the others were disciples from the same sect. Confused, Manhwa asked why the bullies were targeting Sanha. The boy sighed and explained that his sect had never gotten along with the Great Truth sect. Recently, the bullies had discovered that Sanha's sect was weaker than theirs, so they had started picking on him. Mu Hui assumed that the young leader was the one throwing the punches. Curious, Mu Jin asked if Sanha's sect leader knew about the bullying. Sanha replied that yes, his sect leader was aware, and that he used to fight back and beat the bullies. Eventually, the Fresh Flower Sect leader went to the Great Truth sect to address the issue. However, the Great Truth sect leader argued that their disciples wouldn't have acted without reason and blamed Sanha. They attempted to turn the situation into a sect-level conflict, but the Fresh Flower Sect leader, wanting to avoid war, backed off. Mu Hui listened carefully. He knew that if the Fresh Flower Sect were to get into a conflict with the Great Truth sect, it would likely lead to their downfall. Mu Hui assumed the best the Fresh Flower Sect could do was ensure that the Great Truth sect had no reason to invade. He now understood why Sanha had asked for help without directly saying anything, which is that Sanha was concerned that the situation might escalate into a conflict between the two sections. That was also why he had allowed the children to bully him. Manhwa, angry at how an outer sect of Manhwa was being treated, voiced her frustration. Mu Hui explained to them that there was a reason why they were sent to manage the outer sections. He decided it was time to hear the full details from the Fresh Flower Sect leader. At the Fresh Flower Sect, the members were amazed to see the disciples of the Manhwa sect. Mu Hui noted that the main sect disciples were known for the red plum blossoms on their clothing, while the outer sects bore white plum blossoms. He saw that the Fresh Flower Sect's members had white plum blossoms embroidered onto their clothes. Soon, the leader arrived and expressed that they had been waiting to meet them. The four disciples made the fist-palm salute as a respectful greeting, and Mu Hui introduced himself, thanking the leader for the warm welcome. The leader, Lim Muguk, reciprocated the greeting and the salute. He shared that they had been hearing about how Mu Hui and his disciples had managed to take down the brutal blood faction in a single night. Mu Hui humbly replied that the rumors in Jianghu had been exaggerated. It hadn't been done overnight. Muguk laughed, acknowledging that the important thing was that the brutal blood faction had been taken care of. He then asked Sanha if he was the one who brought them there, to which Sanha replied affirmatively. Muguk praised his son, and Mu Hui watched him intently. Muguk invited them inside. Once seated, they had tea, and Mu Chiol commented that the scent was deeper than the plum blossom tea from Manhwa. Mujin added that it tasted great, especially since it was freshly brewed. Muguk humbly replied that it wasn't as good as Manhwa's, adding that he hadn't forgotten the taste of their plum blossom tea and that it made him think of visiting again. Then he realized he should have let them rest before discussing matters further. Mu Hui assured him that it was fine. Since the sect leader had sent them to take care of the outer sects, it was only right to do so. He then inquired about the situation at the Fresh Flower sect. Muguk admitted that they were in a difficult position. When Mu Hui asked if this was due to the Great Truth sect, Muguk confirmed that while their relationship with them had never been good, it had been manageable in the past when both sects were more or less equal in strength. Mu Hui concluded that things must have changed since the Shangxi massacre, and Muguk agreed. He explained that after the Great Truth sect learned the extent of the damage the Fresh Flower sect had suffered, they had become bolder. They had been obstructing the Fresh Flower sect at every turn, and now they were intervening in their interests and provoking them. Muguk shared that even the young leader of the Great Truth sect had been bullying his son. He seemed deeply saddened that Sanha had suffered again that day. Mujin, surprised that Muguk knew about the bullying, asked how he had figured it out. Muguk explained that although his son had tried to hide it, he, as a father, would always know. He admitted that he would love to confront the Great Truth sect with his sword, but he knew that would be exactly what they wanted. He recognized that the Great Truth sect was attempting to take over the Fresh Flower sect, no matter what it took, and there was nothing he could do about it. Despite his son coming home after being bullied, he felt that as a father and as a sect leader, he had failed. Mujin asked why he hadn't asked for help from Manhua. Muguk replied that he was aware of the current situation at Manhua and had planned to request help once they had recovered. He expressed his relief now that the disciples had arrived, saying that he could sense their determination and spirit just from sitting with them. He believed that the presence of Manhua's disciples alone would deter the Great Truth sect. Mu Hui responded, pointing out that if Muguk truly had faith in them, he wouldn't have looked so troubled. Mujin, moved by Muguk's words, agreed enthusiastically until he realized what Mu Hui had just said, which confused him. Mu Hui clarified that if Muguk really believed in the disciples, he wouldn't have made that face when talking about his son. Mu Chiol and Mu Hua, unsure of what Mu Hui meant, exchanged glances. Muguk dismissed the comment, claiming that Mu Hui must have been seeing things. He insisted that not trusting the disciples of Manhua was the same as not trusting Manhua itself. He assured them that there was no way a mere outer sect leader would not trust them, then swiftly changed the subject to dinner. He invited the group to join him for dinner, but Mu Hui, frustrated by Muguk's evasiveness, considered that Muguk may have harbored unrealistic expectations of Manhua's assistance. Mu Hui sympathized with Muguk, understanding that the leader had probably endured hardships while holding on to the hope that Manhua would help. However, what he had received were young disciples on their first outing to the Jianghu. When they arrived, all he saw were kids, and it became clear that Muguk doubted their ability to help against a whole sect. Mu Hui realized that this might be why Muguk had been so hesitant to fully trust them, fearing that the disciples might end up hurt in the face of such overwhelming opposition. While knowing the disciples were trying to help, Muguk decided to treat them during their stay and then send them back. However, Muguk couldn't stop thinking about his son and the other sect members who had been enduring harassment from the Great Truth sect. He felt a deep sense of pity for them. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Muguk also wondered if, deep down, he secretly hoped that the young disciples would step in and offer help. He realized he couldn't even hide his emotions, and he chastised himself for it, feeling almost childish for showing his vulnerability. Yet, he was impressed by how perceptive Mu Hui was, able to read his expression so accurately in such a brief moment. Mu Hui, acknowledging Muguk's kindness, said he appreciated the gesture, but made it clear that they would handle their own dinner. Mu Hua, Mu Chiol, and Mu Jin were all taken aback. Mu Hua, feeling the tension, said that Mu Hui's refusal seemed rude. Internally, Mu Hui thought that it was actually the Fresh Flower sect that had been rude first. Confused, Muguk asked why they were turning down his goodwill. Mu Hui knew he wouldn't be able to change Muguk's mind, and trying to convince him further would be a waste of time. He admitted that he couldn't accept the hospitality from Muguk, especially since they hadn't been of any help to the Fresh Flower sect. It didn't feel right. Everyone was taken aback by this admission. Still confused, Manhwa asked if Mu Hoi really meant that it wasn't right. As she recalled Mu Hoi's teachings about swinging a sword with one's whole body, about sparing lives, and a not-so-peaceful method they employed during the brutal blood faction ambush, and she began to doubt if the person standing before her was truly the same senior disciple she had come to know. She wondered what had happened to him that day. Senior appeared unusually agitated that day, a stark departure from his habitual indifference toward his duty. Manhwa noted that he, who had never truly cared for his responsibilities, now behaved with a focused urgency that suggested something was deeply amiss. As the group ambled along the mountain path, Manhwa remarked quietly that there must be an underlying cause for this sudden change. When Mu Hoi turned around, her surprise was evident, and it became clear that an explanation was both expected and needed. Mu Hoi contemplated internally that the progress made thus far should suffice, provided they were not an exceptionally advanced martial master present at the Fresh Flower Sect. After a reflective pause, he resolved to reveal the cause behind his altered demeanor. In a measured tone, he explained that the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect harbored a deep mistrust toward them, a revelation that complicated their mission. Manhwa recalled that the leader had previously indicated that the Great Truth Sect would cower merely at the sight of their presence, and Mu Hoi confirmed this recollection while questioning the inherent strangeness of such behavior. He recalled how the young disciples of the Great Truth Sect had behaved earlier. Although their youth might suggest inexperience, Mu Hoi stressed that even a child successor was bound by the same strictures of caution in both action and speech. There was a method behind the apparent indiscretion, which was a rationale that could not be ignored. Moreover, if the Great Truth Sect indeed chose retreat simply because of their presence, the situation was even more alarming. The leader of the Fresh Flower Sect was acutely aware of the struggles faced by the Manhwa sect. Despite having dispatched a disciple to oversee matters in the outer regions, the Manhwa contingent now consisted of merely 4 inexperienced disciples venturing into the Jianghu for the first time. The consequences of engaging the Great Truth Sect were dire, that a defeat would not only lead to the absorption of the Fresh Flower Sect by their rival, but also invite widespread criticism that Manhwa had failed to manage its own internal affairs. Such an outcome, Mu Hoi elaborated at length, would be catastrophic for all involved. In the midst of this tense discussion, the matter of strategy arose naturally. Manhwa sought guidance on the appropriate course of action. In response, Mu Hoi reiterated that as long as the underlying issue was resolved, the results would remain favorable. His tone carried quiet confidence, even as he left the specifics unspoken. When further pressed about the method of resolution, she quickly brushed it off and implied that Mu Hoi must already harbor a plan, even if unspoken at that moment. Later that day, upon arriving at an inn, the 4 disciples observed that 2 men from the Great Truth Sect were dining there. Mu Hoi surveyed the scene with dismay, knowing this establishment, which should have been the territory of the Fresh Flower Sect, was now being occupied by outsiders who behaved as if it were their own domain. The discontent in the eyes of the 2 men was unmistakable, suggesting that they were actively seeking vulnerable targets. It was evident that trouble would soon ensue, even if no one intervened directly. The tension escalated when a man clad in a green robe brushed past one of the Great Truth Sect members. The encounter drew immediate disapproving looks from the 2, who clearly noted the man's inebriated state. With a stumbling apology, the man explained that the recent increase in protection fees had stirred up resentment among the locals. In a frustrated whisper, he added that the men's glaring expressions hinted at a readiness to unleash violence on unsuspecting civilians. His parting words confirmed that, despite the inn's traditional ties to the Fresh Flower Sect, the Great Truth Sect had imposed extortion by raising protection fees. As the 4 disciples absorbed these developments, it became evident that the Great Truth Sect had effectively seized control of the inn. Amid murmurs of anger, another guest voiced his frustration. He was accusing the fee collectors of being leeches who not only extorted money, but also took advantage of complimentary food. His words, laced with indignation, were quickly tempered by a companion who cautioned him to speak softly lest their remarks attract unwanted attention. Through this overheard exchange, Mu Hoi deduced that the Great Truth Sect had already taken over the establishment. Their imposition of protection fees had understandably infuriated the local residents. Noticing the rising volume of heated discussion among the guests, Manhwa confidently predicted that conflict was imminent. With deliberate calm, he instructed the three other disciples not to intervene, trusting that events would unfold in their favor. However, Manhwa, often regarded as somewhat absent-minded, struggled to grasp the full implications of Manhwa's directive. Before further clarification could be offered, the situation took a dramatic turn. The two men from the Great Truth Sect abruptly rose from their seats. One, unable to tolerate the mounting tension, declared his frustration and, with a deliberate tap on a nearby guest's shoulder, implied that the guest's earlier remarks had been meant for their ears. The guest, in a tone dripping with condescension and devoid of respect, defiantly challenged the sect members, daring them to act. His inebriated state only magnified his insolence, prompting his companion to urge him to desist. Undeterred, the guest launched into a lengthy diatribe. He asserted that every word he had spoken was justified, denouncing the sect members for their hypocrisy, criticizing them for concealing themselves during an attack by the demonic cult, and then shamelessly extorting the people previously under the Fresh Flower Sect protection. His tirade escalated into a torrent of insults, labeling the offenders as demonic miscreants whose disgrace would forever bar them from public life. Finally, having endured the relentless rant, a member of the Great Truth Sect intervened decisively by seizing the insolent guest, yanking him from his seat, and forcefully throwing him to the floor. This chain of events left no doubt. The Great Truth Sect had seized control of the territory, and their actions cast a long shadow over the unfolding drama. At that moment, the man sneered as if certain his adversaries must consider them fools. He made it clear that insults directed at the Great Truth Sect will be met with severe consequences, all while brandishing his sword menacingly at fallen civilian. In swift response, Manhwa acted without hesitation. With precise aim, he hurled the chopsticks in his hand toward the man. The chopstick struck true, landing squarely on his acupoints and preventing any attempt to strike the civilian. Nearby, the other member of the Great Truth Sect let out a startled scream as the unfolding scene intensified. The aggrieved man, his pride stung, unsheathed his sword and demanded, in a tone of incredulity, an explanation for the unexpected interference. In a fluid motion, Manhwa closed the distance, delivering a kick that sent the man sprawling. Paralyzed by the chopstick still embedded in his shoulder, the man raged in confusion and indignation, questioning why he had been rendered immobile. Calmly retrieving the fallen sword, Manhwa remarked that the very act of wielding a sword toward people without even a modicum of martial arts knowledge was utterly absurd. He noted that while the boundaries between the orthodox and unorthodox alliances were often blurred, the current transgression was far too egregious. The man, recognizing Manhwa as a manhua disciple, as Manhwa inquired about the intended use of the weapon. His explanation, that was meant solely to intimidate, prompted Manhwa to seize the sword firmly and elaborate further. According to Manhwa's logic, the sword was never intended as a tool of casual threat against a weak opponent. He argued that it would be far more sensible for the man not to possess a sword at all. He added that mobility would be restored only once the obstructing chopstick was removed, perhaps by the unconscious man nearby, once he regained awareness, and that the sword might be reclaimed only by presenting himself at the Fresh Flower Sect. This edict left little room for dispute. In response, the man's anger escalated as he protested the interference with the Great Truth Sect's affairs, accusing Manhwa of instigating conflict. Unperturbed, Manhwa countered that even the leader of the Great Truth Sect would never utter such insolence, and that the man's attitude demonstrated a grave underestimation of Manhwa. Though the man stuttered his denials, his words fell flat against Manhwa's resolute rebuke. With final authority, Manhwa decreed that the sole means of absolution lay in the Great Truth Sect leader personally visiting the Fresh Flower Sect to beg for forgiveness. He warned that if the leader failed to appear by sunrise the next day, the Great Truth Sect would be consigned to oblivion. His unwavering stare and commanding tone brooked no resistance, and the man, with little choice, conceded as the three observing disciples watched in silence. Amid the simmering tension, Manhwa remarked that her senior disciple's brazenness seemed to grow with each passing day, suggesting that a preemptive ambush on the Great Truth Sect might have been more prudent. Mujin concurred with this assessment, while Mu Chiol voiced his apprehensions about the unfolding events. The following morning, the leader of the Great Truth Sect strode confidently toward the Fresh Flower Sect. Finally, armed with reason to challenge his rivals, he advanced with a smile and was flanked by his most senior members. Despite a clear sky overhead, an ominous thought suggested that those approaching should prepare for an impending storm of bloodshed. Muguk had only experienced such moments 3 times in his life. It felt as though a massive boulder was pressing down on his chest, suffocating him and making it hard to breathe. The first came during the bloody battle with the Black Knight Palace, when the disciples of Manhwa and its branch sects were slaughtered. The second came when his eldest son had passed away. The third was when he discovered that his youngest son was being bullied. Now, another moment had been added to that list: the arrival of the Great Truth Sect leader, accompanied by their strongest disciples. Mu Hui greeted them at the gate with Muguk standing behind him. Despite Mu Hui's tender age in the Jianghu, his expression remained unfazed, showing no fear whatsoever. Mu Hui observed their faces, and Mu Hui spoke, recognizing the lack of apology. Mu Hui looked at the sect leader and noted with a mocking tone in his words as he addressed him. The opposition sect's leader regarded him with amusement. He questioned whether Manhwa had taught him martial arts, but neglected his manners. Mu Hui responded with a tone laced with mockery, acknowledging his own lack of etiquette, but pointing out that the Great Truth Sect was far more negligent in such matters. The atmosphere surrounding the group was suffused with a killing intent, making them seem less like members of an orthodox sect and more akin to unorthodox warriors. No, perhaps even demonic cultists. The sect leader's temper flared at the young disciple's words, his hand reaching for his sword. Mu Hui, however, calmly interrupted him, suggesting that instead of standing there in a tense standoff, they move inside to avoid drawing the wrong attention. After all, the situation could easily be misconstrued, and given the claims of the Great Truth Sect being orthodox, misunderstandings would not help their cause. His words defused the tension, making the sect leader reconsider. The sect leader dismissed the remark, accusing Mu Hui of merely stalling for time. But since the matter would be settled regardless, perhaps there was some amusement to be found in humoring him. Reluctantly, the leader agreed to move inside. Had he refused, Mu Hui had already decided on breaking his wrist and dragging him inside, though such action was now unnecessary. Muguk, seeing how things were unfolding, simply gestured for the visitors to come in. Everything had gone as Mu Hui predicted, but now Muguk began to feel a growing unease. He had anticipated the situation, yet the weight of what had just transpired was heavy on his chest. The more he thought about it, the more nervous he became. He reflected on the moment he received the news of Mu Hui's actions. As soon as he had learned what Mu Hui had done, Muguk could not contain his frustration. He demanded to know why Mu Hui had done this, especially since he had hoped to avoid unnecessary conflict with the Great Truth Sect. Mu Hui responded calmly, affirming that he understood Muguk's concerns but offering no apology for his actions. Muguk, unable to suppress his frustration, asked why Mu Hui would act this way despite understanding the situation. Mu Hui then urged Muguk to calm down and speak honestly, offering a more measured approach to the conversation. Mu Hui continued, acknowledging that Muguk did not trust them. He explained that when the sect leader had sent them to observe the branch sects, they hadn't been given specific instructions or deadlines. The sect leader had trusted them to use their judgment, making decisions as necessary while overseeing Mount Hua's branch sections. He also mentioned that the areas they were assigned to investigate were quite expansive: Pasung, Weinan, and Yeo Mountain, and the responsibility of covering such a large area with just 4 disciples was not insignificant. Mu Hui admitted that he had left out some important details until now. He explained that the brutal blood faction in Pasung had connections with a warrior from the 9 Hellsword sect. Since their intention was to eliminate the brutal blood faction, a confrontation had been unavoidable. To avoid attracting unwanted attention from the 9 Hellsword sect, they had to handle the situation discreetly. Still skeptical, Muguk questioned whether Mu Hui and the others had truly subdued a warrior from the 9 Hellsword sect without injury, especially with only 4 people involved. Mu Hui clarified that it hadn't been 4 of them. It had been him alone who had dealt with a warrior. Now even more incredulous, Muguk asked how that could possibly be true. Mu Hui simply nodded, affirming the reality of the situation. He then spoke with conviction, emphasizing that just as the Manhwa sect leader had placed trust in them, the Fresh Flower sect needed to trust them as well. Manhwa offered to prove his capabilities, suggesting that if Muguk doubted him, he could challenge him to a spar right then and there, and he will draw his sword without hesitation. However, Muguk did not take him up on the offer. Instead, Muguk asked if Manhwa truly believed they could handle the entire Great Truth sect should it come to that. Manhwa's response was unwavering. He assured Muguk that there was no need for such a confrontation, but even if a bloody battle were to break out, he would be more than capable of handling it alone. There was no doubt in his voice. He then spoke further, sharing his insights on the expected course of events. It was through this approach that the Great Truth sect leader had been brought to the table for discussion. Yet, despite those words, human nature was cunning, and now that the leader sat before them, the situation felt different. What had begun as a dispute between Manhwa and a disciple of the Great Truth sect had evolved into something far greater, deeply entangling the two sects in conflict. Manhwa proceeded with mediation, identifying himself as a disciple of Manhwa and recognizing the Fresh Flower sect as one of its branches. He suggested that it would be best for both sides to resolve the matter together. Since neither sect seemed inclined to coexist in Waynon, Manhwa got straight to the point. He proposed that each sect select a representative and settle the matter with a duel. His tone was calm and nonchalant as he made the offer. At those words, a wave of horror washed over Muguk. It was as though something inside him had snapped, triggered by the proposal. On the other hand, the leader of the Great Truth sect laughed upon hearing Manhwa's suggestion. He turned toward Muguk, a knowing smile on his face. He mused aloud, finally realizing the situation. He questioned whether this was a plan that Muguk and the Manhwa brat had devised together. He had thought there might be some trickery involved when they were invited in, but the suggestion of a duel seemed far too absurd to be a tactic. He mockingly wondered if Muguk had lost his mind, as there was no way that the brat would have proposed such a thing. Manhwa, hearing the leader's mocking expression, noticed the subtle shift in Muguk's demeanor when the leader mentioned the death of Muguk's eldest son. It was something Manhwa hadn't known before. It became apparent in the way Muguk's gaze hardened. The leader's words seemed to strike a painful memory in Muguk, and Manhwa understood the discomfort. Manhwa's eyes remained fixed on Muguk, his concern growing as the leader mocked how Muguk had placed his faith in a young Manhwa disciple, thinking that the brat would resolve everything. The leader's words had indeed hit a raw nerve, and Manhwa's voice, using the voice transmission technique, asked whether Muguk's son had been killed in a duel with the Great Truth sect. Manhwa quickly apologized, realizing that he had unintentionally brought up a painful memory. He repeated his apologies through the transmission, but Muguk, though clearly affected, reassured him that it was his fault for not bringing it up earlier. He trusted Manhwa and urged him to continue. Manhwa gave a brief acknowledgement, expressing his gratitude before refocusing on the matter at hand. While there were things he hadn't been aware of, he understood the weight of the situation. He proposed that 3 individuals participate in the duel: the sect leader, the young master, and the strongest fighters from each sect. For the Fresh Flower sect, Manhwa would take the role of the strongest fighter. He then suggested that they set the duel for 5 days later. The Great Truth sect leader, though still mocking the idea, requested that they consider their current situation. He explained that the last time they had been falsely accused of killing someone, it had caused a major headache for him. He was now cautious about being branded a murderer again, wondering if they would face such an accusation once more. Unbothered, Manhwa responded nonchalantly, explaining that the Great Truth sect was already being labeled as a demonic cult by the commoners. He reassured the leader that there was no need for concern in that regard. The sect leader, irritated by Manhwa's words, warned him that his mouth had been getting on his nerves. He threatened to attack the Fresh Flower sect right then and there, but admitted that he was holding back because Manhwa's proposal intrigued him. Manhwa continued his taunts, responding that he had only spoken out because he thought the leader wasn't fully aware of the situation. The leader, now visibly angered, warned Manhwa to watch his tongue, saying that they were only tolerating him for now. One of the Great Truth sect disciples sneered at Manhwa, suggesting that the brat thought they were easy targets because they had been holding back. Manhwa's gaze turned cold as he met the sneer, radiating enough killing intent to silence the disciple. The man, intimidated, stood nervously, unsure of the depth of Mu Hoi's strength. The Great Truth Sect leader, seeing the tense atmosphere, finally stood up and agreed to the proposal, stating that they would return in 5 days to settle the matter. Before leaving, he added that he hoped the duel would be fair and that no one would lose their life. Once they left, Muguk let out a deep sigh, his mind still troubled. He revealed that the Great Truth Sect's young master was far weaker than his own son in martial arts. While the sect leader and he had once been equals, the leader had now surpassed him. Muguk suspected that the warrior Mu Hoi would face might not be a true disciple, but an assassin the Great Truth Sect had secretly hired and disguised as a guest warrior. Mu Hoi nodded in agreement, acknowledging the possibility. Still unsure, Muguk asked if Mu Hoi was truly certain about the upcoming duel. Mu Hoi, without hesitation, replied that he was confident and might even find the duel too easy. Muguk, trusting him, agreed to put his faith in Mu Hoi and decided to proceed with the preparations. Mu Hoi suggested they head to the training ground, much to Muguk's surprise. He explained that while he couldn't be sure if the training would help, for the next 4 days, Muguk should consider himself as good as dead in terms of the difficulty he would face. Soon, they were at the training ground, where Mu Hoi began to train Muguk intensely, all the while being watched by 3 disciples who were both terrified and fascinated by what they saw. Among them, Manhwa voiced her concerns to her senior brother, Mujin, asking if this was truly the right approach, to which Mujin responded with uncertainty. Undeterred, Muguk pushed himself as though his life depended on it. His legs were tied to a tree branch, and he was forced to lift his body to do sit-up and hold it up, struggling under the weight of the intense training. Mu Hoi stood underneath him, holding a sword pointed upward, ready to welcome Muguk if he faltered. With a stern voice, Mu Hoi urged Muguk to push through. He reminded him that if he couldn't even handle this training, the Fresh Flower Sect would be finished. When Muguk hesitated, Mu Hoi's calm voice carried a hint of real threat, urging him to get back up quickly. As Muguk struggled to continue, one of the disciples, Manhwa, silently wondered if even the demonic cult would be impressed by such methods. In her mind, Mu Hoi's relentlessness seemed inhuman, bordering on demonic. Nearing the end of the day, the golden sun started to dim. Muguk continued his intense training with the sword still stood beneath his back. This time, the sword was held by Mukil. The manhua disciple warned that if Muguk lowered himself any further, he would be at risk of being stabbed. He encouraged him to hold on just a little longer, reassuring him that the training would soon be over and to stay strong until the very end. Mukil couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy as he watched, recalling that the senior disciple had assigned him the task of overseeing the sect leader's training, though he wondered where the senior brother had gone. Meanwhile, Santa sat alone, sulking. He was growing increasingly anxious about the upcoming duel in 5 days. Master Mu Hoi had promised to personally train him until the duel, but Santa knew that just 4 days of training wouldn't suddenly make him stronger. He voiced his frustration loudly, kicking a stone away from him in frustration. It was then that Mu Hoi appeared suddenly, startling Sanha. Santa immediately called out to Mu Hoi in surprise. Mu Hoi, picking up on the boy's earlier frustration, answered him directly. He explained that martial arts, as Santa had already stated, couldn't be mastered in just a short time with intense training. Growth took time, unless through a lucky encounter or a special elixir. However, that only applied to improving martial arts skills. That experience was different. How one used martial arts was a separate issue altogether. Mu Hoi then posed a question to Sanha, who was still trying to understand the lesson. Mu Hoi asked if Sanha was properly utilizing the martial arts he already possessed. Sanha snapped out of his daze, quickly replying that he knew his body best. Mu Hoi instructed him to watch closely and follow along, assuring him that this would be sufficient for now. Still confused, Sanha asked what exactly he was supposed to follow. Without further explanation, Mu Hoi suddenly sent a stone flying through the air with incredible speed, striking a tree with such force that the wood splintered from a considerable distance. Sanha watched in awe as Mu Hoi explained that he had infused the stone with energy slightly weaker than what children his age typically had. He pointed out that Santa's internal energy was much stronger than this, and so he should be able to control his energy at that level. Mu Hui then challenged Sanha to demonstrate how he could handle his internal energy. He promised that if Sanha succeeded, the training would be over for the day. If not, they would continue until he managed it, advising him not to worry too much. Still in disbelief, Sanha was instructed to begin throwing the stone. Later, the evidence of his efforts was visible on a tree within the sect, marking his progress. It wasn't perfect, but Mu Hui noted that Sanha had significantly improved. He decided to stop the training for the day and instructed Sanha to rest. As Mu Hui reminded him to get some rest, Sanha was utterly exhausted. He slumped his knees, his left hand, which had been used for the training, trembling in pain, blistered and red. Frustrated, Sanha muttered to himself that Master Mu Hui was a demon. He complained that Mu Hui had told him to rest, but the boy felt that no rest was possible with the intense training. His frustration was clear in his voice as he muttered that the sun had risen, but rest was still out of the question. No tears came, but his frustration were palpable. A few hours later, Mu Hui gathered Muguk and Sanha for the second day of training. He informed them that from now on, they would train together, as time was short. Mu Hui then asked if they remembered the lessons from the previous day, particularly the importance of using their bodies effectively. Both Muguk and Sanha nodded, sat on their knee before Mu Hui in acknowledgement. Mu Hui noted that Muguk's physical condition had greatly improved, likely due to his diligent training. His body, once stiff, had quickly regained its previous form. Mu Hui praised their progress and explained that today's training would build upon the foundation established the previous day. He unsheathed his sword and informed them that the focus for the day would be on finding their composure. Instead of further explaining, he felt it would be more effective to show them directly. With a firm instruction to take their positions, he prepared for the next phase of training. The three second-generation disciples, Manhwa, Mujin, and Mukyil, stood ready with their swords in hand, prepared to demonstrate their skills in front of their senior disciple. All the disciples of the Manhwa sect stood before their senior, Mu Hui, their attention fixed on him, with Sanha watching closely. The tension in the air was palpable. Muguk wondered to himself about the nature of the duel, his thoughts echoing his surprise. Both he and Sanha could sense the intensity of the situation. The three disciples, equally nervous, knew all too well the ruthless nature of their senior disciple, Mu Hui. Mukyil, Manhwa, and Mujin, the only ones who truly understood Mu Hui's fierce approach, couldn't hide their own anxiety. Manhwa spoke first, announcing her intention to go ahead. Following her, Mujin said to prepare for their moves. The three then took their stances. Without warning, Manhwa charged forward, her sword aimed at a fatal strike. However, Mu Hui remained still, using the scabbard of his sword to deflect her swift attack. When Manhwa tried again, swinging her hand downward to strike at his head, Mu Hui merely shifted slightly to evade the blow. Though a woman, Manhwa was also a warrior, and she didn't hesitate to fight back. In retaliation, Mu Hui kicked her ruthlessly in the chest, sending her flying backward. At that moment, Mujin appeared from behind, poised to strike. But Mu Hui was quick, swinging his sword upward to completely neutralize Mujin's attack. With calm precision, Mu Hui returned a series of sword strikes toward Mujin, each one pushing him back. Watching the scene unfold, Sanha, overwhelmed by the violence, whispered to his father, expressing concern about the dangerous nature of the training. Equally troubled, Muguk agreed, but decided to observe further, unsure of what exactly Mu Hui was trying to teach them. Mu Hui then delivered a precise strike with his sword scabbard to Mujin's chest, causing him to stagger back. Noticing the timing, Mukyil suddenly screamed for Mujin to duck. In that instant, Mu Hui's sword moved, and Mujin ducked just in time as Mukyil's sword narrowly missed him. With nonchalance, Mu Hui met the incoming sword with his own, calmly blocking it while letting out a small sigh. Mu Hui muttered that Mukyil's sword felt heavier than before, though it was still not enough. He added that it wasn't enough to stop him, as his blade moved along the length of Mukyil's sword and stopped, inches from his neck. Realizing his defeat, Mukyil admitted he had lost. Mu Hui then evaluated each of the disciples' weaknesses. He remarked that Manhwa's attacks were predictable and easy to counter. while Mujin was too passive in his approach. As for Mukiel, he hadn't yet fully adapted to his new sword technique. These were the major flaws that Mu Hui identified. He acknowledged that there were other issues to address, but emphasized that they should focus on the points he had just highlighted first. Turning his attention to Muguk and Manhwa, Mu Hui explained that today's training, and the entire training leading up to the duel, would follow this intense pattern. Still confused, Muguk asked for clarification. He questioned how this brutal training could be the way to find composure, as Mu Hui had earlier stated. Mu Hui confirmed that the goal was indeed composure, but not in the way Muguk might have imagined. He asked Muguk if he had noticed anything unusual about the duel. Muguk, still uneasy, responded that the intensity was the most obvious difference. Muguk then exclaimed in disbelief, as if he understood something. Mu Hui explained that one of the best ways to improve quickly was by gaining real combat experience, and the quickest way to achieve that was by repeatedly facing near-death situations. He added that once one had experienced the dangers of life-or-death combat multiple times, dodging attacks from ordinary fighters would become second nature. Mu Hui then instructed Muguk and Manhwa to grab their swords, stating that their goal was to kill him. He clarified that from that moment on, the training would be as close to real combat as possible. Muguk, horrified by the suggestion, immediately protested, fearing the severity of the training, especially with Manhwa present. But Manhwa, determined, set his eyes on his goal. He had already made up his mind. Without hesitation, he scooped up a handful of dirt and, in a flash of inspiration, he ditched the orthodox strats in the trash, then threw the dirt straight toward Mu Hui's face. The unorthodox move took Mu Hui by surprise, showing the young disciple's quick thinking and willingness to adapt. Without hesitation, Manhwa charged forward, his sword gripped tightly in his hand. Determined to make the best of the situation, he resolved to give his all, despite his reluctance. He gritted his teeth, mentally preparing himself for the inevitable beating that would follow. In one swift motion, Manhwa unsheathed his sword, swinging it horizontally toward Mu Hui. His unorthodox approach proved to be effective, creating an opening. However, Mu Hui wasn't particularly angered by the unorthodox strat. Instead, he simply covered his eyes with one hand and observed Manhwa's movements closely. When Manhwa came within range, Mu Hui effortlessly kicked him, sending him hurtling through the air with a force that suggested no restraint. In truth, Mu Hui had only exerted a fraction of his strength, careful not to kill the young man. Meanwhile, Muguk remained kneeling on the ground, seemingly oblivious to the intense situation unfolding around him. He turned his head, calling out to his son, as Manhwa crashed some distance away. However, Muguk had little time to worry about his son, as his instinct screamed for him to react. He quickly turned his head back. In the nick of time, Muguk ducked down, narrowly avoiding a horizontal strike from Mu Hui's sword. Mu Hui stopped the swing abruptly and then brought the sword down, the blade striking the ground just as Muguk leaped backward. He landed beside Manhwa, who called out to him, prompting Muguk to ask if his son was okay. Despite the pain, Manhwa assured his father he could endure it. Muguk expressed relief at hearing his son's response. But before they could fully recover, Mu Hui appeared behind them, almost as though materializing out of thin air. Mu Hui casually questioned whether they planned to chat during the duel. Both father and son turned in surprise to face the manhua disciple. Muguk was the first to respond. He swung his sword at Mu Hui, but the strike was easily stopped by Mu Hui's hand, done with effortless ease. Mu Hui's words were laced with calm authority. He reminded them to treat the duel as real combat, stressing that only by moving as if their lives depended on it could both the sect leader and his son survive. With a chilling calmness, Mu Hui prepared for the next round. At that moment, both Muguk and Manhwa understood the gravity of the situation. They knew they would face severe consequences if they didn't commit fully to the sparring. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Muguk remained determined, putting everything he had into each of his sword strikes. However, Mu Hui stood like an unmovable wall, blocking each attack as if sparring with a child, displaying an unsettling indifference. Muguk kept charging, launching strike after strike, but Mu Hui stepped back with calculated precision, evading each one. In a sudden motion, Mu Hui landed a punch to Muguk's face, causing him to involuntarily close his eyes. In that instant, Mu Hui brandished his sword, placing it at Muguk's neck, forcing him to open his eyes in surprise. Mu Hui's voice was casual but precise as he mentioned that Muguk had died 314 times. He then reminded Muguk that closing his eyes made it difficult to react to attacks. Muguk attempted to defend himself, arguing that even with his eyes closed, he could still sense movements using his internal energy. Mu Hui acknowledged that internal energy, if properly used, could grant a sense akin to sight. He noted that it was an essential skill, one that should not be difficult for a sect leader like Muguk. He then posed a simple but undeniable question. If Muguk could sense the movements, why couldn't he dodge? Muguk, attempting to justify himself, admitted that Mu Hui's attacks were simply too fast. Mu Hui scoffed at the excuse. He pointed out that if Muguk had kept his eyes open, he could have easily dodged the attacks. Even with his eyes closed, proper use of internal energy would have been enough to sense the incoming strikes. Mu Hui's words were sharp. He reminded Muguk that mistakes in combat were not something to blame on other factors. If a mistake led to death, there would be no second chances. As he withdrew his sword, preparing for the next round, he emphasized the importance of not letting such mistakes happen. With a firm kick, Mu Hui pushed Muguk back and signaled the beginning of the next bout. Despite the exhaustion, Muguk's determination remained unshaken. He gritted his teeth, ready to continue. As the sun finally started to disappear behind the mountain range, Muguk charged once more toward Mu Hui, a renewed resolve in his movements. Meanwhile, Mu Hui stood in place, perfectly poised and ready for whatever attack Muguk would offer. Manhua lay on the ground, utterly drained from the sparring. The day eventually gave way to night. Muguk, completely spent, collapsed onto the ground. Mu Hui, however, remained standing, unwavering. Turning his attention to Manhua, Mu Hui instructed him to keep going, as though his stamina were limitless. Through the night, Manhua endured a relentless beating, all the while receiving continuous instructions from Mu Hui. As soon as Muguk regained enough strength to stand, he immediately rejoined the sparring. With each exchange, their movements grew sharper and more precise. By the end of the night, Muguk had reached a point where he could keep his eyes open to track Mu Hui's sword strikes. But the training was far from over. For 3 consecutive days, Mu Hui continued to push both father and son to their limits. The two men sparred until they could barely move. As soon as they regained enough strength, Mu Hui was back in position, ready to continue the training without pause. Elsewhere, the leader of the Great Truth Sect sat with a sword master he had hired. The sword master, Yonho Blade Master, remarked that if the second-generation disciple of Manhwa Sect were truly skilled, the energy-charged sword should have been more than enough to defeat him. The Great Truth Sect leader admitted that while that might be true, his real goal was to humiliate the Manhwa disciples thoroughly. The leader of the sect suggested that to put the Manhwa disciples in their place, it would be better to do so overwhelmingly, to ensure their defeat was undeniable. Yonho responded with a wry smile, acknowledging his swordsmanship, but pointing out that calling it overwhelming seemed a bit much. Yonho's grin deepened, stating that regardless of the outcome, the Manhwa disciples would be lucky not to be crippled. Still, Yonho voiced his concerns, asking if the sect leader was sure about this approach. If someone were to get injured, or worse, killed, it could cause significant problems for them. The leader of the Great Truth Sect shrugged off the concern, dismissing rumors as irrelevant. Yonho raised an eyebrow, challenging the sect leader's casual dismissal of the situation. If rumors were truly so inconsequential, why was he so worried about them? If things went wrong, it wouldn't just be Manhwa they would need to worry about. Every other faction in Jianghu might take notice and start to hold them in check. The leader assured him not to worry. There was already a faction in Jianghu with a similar reputation, and he was confident he could handle any potential fallout from their actions. Yonho, deep in thought, began to question the sect leader's arrogance. He wondered how far the leader was willing to push things. Could someone who disregarded the possible consequences truly be so sure of their strength? Yonho contemplated the situation carefully, his thoughts turning to the Fresh Flower Sect leader, whose martial arts were competent, but still a step below his own. Was this arrogance blinding the leader to the risks? Was the leader's greed starting to cloud his judgment? With a sense of finality, Yonho concluded that once this situation was over, it might be time to seek a new place to belong. On the night before the duel, Muhui sat atop a pavilion roof in the Fresh Flower Sect, watching Mukiel train diligently in the yard below. As he observed Mukiel's movements, Muhui evaluated him with a critical eye. The young disciple moved well with the sword, though it wasn't particularly heavy. It might be time for Mukiel to switch to a heavier blade, possibly even a great sword, Muhui thought to himself. His thoughts quickly shifted to the Great Truth Sect and their possible plans. Though Muhui had expected them to send assassins, he was surprised by how quiet they had been. It seemed they underestimated both Manhwa and the Fresh Flower Sect. Muhui scowled inwardly. If the Great Truth Sect had sent assassins, he could have used that as a reason to raze them to the ground, but it seemed they weren't bold enough to make that move. What a shame, Muhui thought. Just then, Muhui heard footsteps. To his surprise, Muguk, the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect, was walking through the yard, deep in thought. Muguk's expression was serene, his eyes calm and full of life as he gazed at the distance, completely unfazed by the impending duel the following day. There was no sign of fear or anxiety in his demeanor. After a while, he turned and headed back to his residence. Muhui, observing the scene, thought to himself that the sect leader didn't linger for too long. He simply looked at the moon before leaving, his thoughts no doubt on the duel. Muhui reflected on the fact that Muguk's eldest son had died in a duel against the Great Truth Sect. In a sense, tomorrow's duel could be seen as an act of revenge. Muhui wondered what that kind of revenge felt like, finally avenging a loss. As the night passed and the sun rose, the scene shifted to the arena where the duel would take place. The martial artists of the Great Truth Sect, upon seeing Santa's battered face, were surprised and curious. They couldn't understand what had happened to the young master of the Fresh Flower Sect, his face swollen and bruised, barely able to open his right eye. Sanha entered the arena unfazed, standing before the young master of the Great Truth Sect. Despite the obvious signs of his previous sparring with Muhui, his sole focus was on himself. The Great Truth Sect's young master mocked Sanha, remarking on his pathetic appearance and claiming to feel sorry for him, though his words were laced with sarcasm. Sanha, however, ignored him completely, his thoughts consumed by his complaint about the duel. He voiced his frustration that they would be using wooden swords for the contest. The harsh training from Muhui had left its mark, not just on Santa's battered face, but on his tone as well. The spoiled young master dismissed the concern with a smirk, remarking on how fortunate it was that the weapon in his hand was not a real sword. If it had been, he mused, he might have accidentally killed his opponent. His words carried the usual arrogance, yet there was no immediate response. Sanha remained motionless, prompting his adversary to ponder the unusual stillness. Something felt off. Typically, Sanha would react in anger to even the slightest provocation, but now he stood eerily calm. The spoiled young master felt irritation creeping in. Was he being ignored? The thought alone stoked his fury as he fixed a heated glare upon his opponent. As the tension in the air thickened, the referee's voice cut through it with authority. With a composed demeanor, Hyong Hongwon stepped forward, announcing his role as the observer and referee for the duel. He explained the nature of the fight, a comparison of martial skills where injuries were inevitable. However, should the situation grow too severe, he would intervene at his own discretion. Regardless of the outcome, all 3 rounds of the duel would proceed, a rule that all present were expected to acknowledge. The gathered disciples listened attentively, anticipation hanging heavy among them. Amidst the crowd, Muhui lounged with ease. Despite having gone without rest since instigating the duel, his sharp presence remained undiminished. His attention, however, did not linger on the match between the 2 young masters. Having personally trained Sanha, he harbored no concern over the boy losing to a spoiled opponent. Instead, his gaze settled on an individual among the ranks of the opposing sect. Among the disciples of the Great Truth Sect sat the Blade Master, Yonho. All indications suggested that he would be the 3rd participant in the duel, taking the place of the strongest combatant. Muhui seemed recognized him, yet he regarded his presence with nonchalance, quietly wondering why the Blade Master had come. Meanwhile, Hyong concluded his explanation, remarking on how much he had spoken before acknowledging that such an introduction was necessary. He requested understanding from those present, then swiftly moved to the main event. With a final declaration, he announced the beginning of the first duel. At that moment, the Great Truth Sect's young master surged forward, closing the distance between himself and his opponent with 2 rapid strides. A battle cry erupted from his lips, an eager proclamation of his intent to utterly crush his adversary. His wooden sword swung wide, aiming to land a decisive strike. Yet Manhwa remained still. The attack came from the very same boy who had tormented him daily, the same one who had tirelessly sought to stir conflict between their sect. But now, standing before him, Manhwa saw through it all. His movements carried unnecessary flourish. The gestures felt exaggerated, too grand, too overdone. In truth, they were precisely that. Mu Hui's past teachings echoed in Manhwa's mind, recalling the wisdom imparted to him. Fighters who lacked true strength often exaggerated their movements, hoping to create an illusion of dominance. They sought to intimidate, to make opponents shrink away in fear. That was their true objective. For those unfamiliar with martial arts or possessing only a shallow understanding, such intimidation might prove effective. But for those who had even a basic grasp of combat, the tactic was nothing more than a useless display. These lessons had shaped Manhwa, and now he stood before his opponent with unwavering resolve, his sword already poised for action. In the brief span of a single breath, Manhwa shifted. His hand drew back slightly before launching forward with precision, striking just below his opponent's chest. The impact reverberated through the spoiled young master's body, his insides twisting from a force. The strike had been executed with such speed that he failed to react in time. But Manhwa did not stop. Even as his first attack landed, his other hand was already in motion. His fist connected with the young master's face, sending him hurtling backward with ruthless force. Though Manhwa remained unaffected by his opponent's taunts, the power behind his strikes showed no mercy. A cheer erupted from the Fresh Flower Sect's ranks as one of the disciples voiced their confidence. As expected of their young master, they had never doubted his ability. Only after enduring the relentless blows did the spoiled young master realize the full extent of what had happened. Gasping for breath, he finally registered that Manhwa had not even moved from his original spot. The pain coursing through his body was undeniable, the sensation far too intense for him to comprehend. He struggled to accept that Manhwa's attacks could hurt this much. A chilling realization dawned upon him. His opponent was no longer the same person he once knew. Something about him had changed. His battered face remained familiar, his external appearance unchanged. Yet there was something different, something that eluded him. His thoughts drifted toward the possibility of Manhwa having consumed an elixir, much like he himself had done. Meanwhile, Manhwa's mind remained unclouded. The days spent training with the disciples of Manhwa under Mu Hui's rigorous guidance had been nothing short of hell. That period of relentless sparring had reshaped him entirely. Through those grueling experiences, he had come to understand just how weak someone like the spoiled brat before him truly was. The defeated young master, struggling to make sense of what had transpired, demanded an explanation. His voice rang with disbelief as he shouted accusations, questioning what trick had been used. How could someone grow this strong in such a short period? Before an answer could be uttered, Manhwa swiftly kicked his opponent's leg, knocking him off balance once again. The brat barely had time to stabilize himself before being thrown down again. Yet Manhwa remained indifferent. His resolve shone through his partially opened eyes, unwavering in its intensity. To him, this was nothing more than child's play, merely a minor scuffle compared to the battles where he had fought with his life on the line. The spoiled brat collapsed once more, his incompetence on full display. He had failed to inflict even the smallest injury upon Manhwa, yet he himself had been taken down repeatedly. Manhwa observed the fallen opponent, unimpressed. Despite the duel still being in progress, his adversary remained slow to rise, distracted by his own complaints. Gassian recognized something in Manhwa's voice, a warning, an impending strike. If this were a real battle, Manhwa remarked coldly, Gassian would already be dead. Panic overtook the fallen young master. Through teary eyes, he cried out, pleading for mercy. The arrogance once plastered across his face had vanished. leaving behind only raw, unfiltered fear. Santa showed no interest in his pleas. Without hesitation, his sword descended, carrying the same ferocity and mercilessness as before. Terror gripped Gassian entirely, his face drained of all color, his expression mirroring that of prey before a predator's final strike. The sword, however, did not touch him. It crashed onto the floor beside him, its edge harmless. And yet, the damage had already been done. The once proud young talent of Wynham had been reduced to nothing more than a trembling child, utterly broken. Santa scoffed at the fallen figure, his voice laced with disdain. Once, they had called him the greatest genius of Wynham. But from this moment forward, he would carry a different title, the biggest coward of Wynham. Witnesses from both sects stood in silent shock as the scene unfolded. Then, amidst the silence, something unmistakable occurred. Gassian, in front of all present, lost control, the humiliation complete. With no will left to fight, the observer made the official call. The first duel had ended in victory for the Fresh Flower Sect. The leader of the Great Truth Sect clenched his fists, seething with rage. The brat had dared to humiliate his son, swinging a sword so seriously in what was supposed to be a children's duel. Santa had come fully prepared. In a muttered breath, he voiced his displeasure. He had even given Gassian an elixir as a precaution, never once considering that he would still lose. But in the end, it mattered little. Victory in the remaining 2 duels was all but assured. His confidence did not waver, for he believed there would be no trouble securing a win against Muguk. The arena was swiftly cleared as the observer called for the next participants. And so, the moment arrived. The leaders of both sects stepped forward to face one another. Muguk studied his opponent carefully. A few months ago, rumors had circulated that the Great Truth Sect leader had taken a rare elixir. Now, standing before him, Muguk could confirm with certainty that the rumors were true. Yet even with this revelation, his expression remained unshaken. He had spent his time preparing for this very moment, and now, unnecessary thoughts had no place in his mind. Emotions were meaningless. He would face this battle just as he had faced training under Master Muhui. His opponent, however, took notice of Muguk's demeanor. The Great Truth Sect leader understood that his adversary must have realized the truth about the elixir. And yet, Muguk's face showed nothing but composure, more so than before. Scoffing inwardly, the sect leader mused to himself. That calm expression would not last for long. The observer's voice rang out once more, signaling the start of the second bout. The moment the announcement was made, the Great Truth Sect master vanished from sight. Yet, Muguk remained composed, his senses heightened as he extended his inner energy to feel his surroundings. He stood still, waiting for the inevitable strike. In a fraction of a second, a swift attack came from the side, aimed directly at his neck. Instinct took over as Muguk ducked just in time, the blade missing its mark by a hair's breadth. Without hesitation, he seized his opponent's arm, and in one fluid motion, he swung his sword wide, aiming for the opponent's head. The Great Truth Sect leader reacted instantly, pulling his head back just enough to avoid a fatal strike. The blade barely grazed his cheek, drawing a thin line of blood, but he showed no sign of hesitation. In response, he retaliated with a powerful kick to Muguk's chest. However, Muguk raised his sword at the last moment, using its flat side to absorb the impact. Despite successfully blocking the kick, the force behind it sent him staggering back a few steps. A smug voice broke the tension. The Great Truth Sect leader admitted that he had been restraining his strength, cautious after a previous incident, but he now saw no need for such restraint. However, Muguk remained silent. The provocation meant nothing to him, and his unwavering focus stayed locked on his opponent. Declaring that he would fight with his full strength, the Great Truth Sect leader lunged forward once more. His movements carried greater power now, his attacks fueled by true intent. He brought his sword down with force, yet for all his strength his stance was flawed. Muguk read the movement with ease and met the strike head-on. As their blades clashed, Muguk felt himself slightly pushed back, but his footing remained firm. Sparks scattered from the collision of steel, and the sharp clang of metal echoed through the arena. The battle intensified, neither side relenting. Each exchanged blow reverberated through the air, the world around them silenced by the relentless rhythm of clashing swords. The wind itself seemed to vanish, replaced solely by the sound of their deadly contest. Muguk's keen eyes caught every flaw in his opponent's form. Each time the Great Truth Sect leader linked his techniques, small openings appeared. When he swung upward, generating a powerful sword wind, his right thigh became momentarily exposed. Every weakness, every gap in his defense stood out, thanks to the rigorous training Muguk had endured. Had the Great Truth Sect leader trained under Master Manhwa, these bad habits would have long been corrected. For a time, Muguk had believed that defeating his opponent would require either luck or an elixir. But now, with clarity born from relentless training, he understood something far more valuable. Master Manhwa had not simply beaten strength into him. He had given him the ability to see through his opponent. Confidence surged through him. The years of hardship, the grueling sessions of training, all had led to this moment. With unwavering resolve, Muguk lifted his sword, his grip tightening. Then, with a single step, he closed the distance in an instant. His blade cut clean through the opening in his opponent's side. A sharp gasp escaped the Great Truth Sect leader as blood sprayed from the deep wound, painting the battlefield in crimson. Somehow, even with blood spilled, the leader of the Great Truth Sect managed to steady himself. He planted his feet firmly on the arena floor, pivoted to shift direction, and attempted another attack. The leader swung his sword wide, aiming directly at Muguk. However, Muguk met the blade with equal force, effortlessly deflecting it with a scoff. The assault did not stop there. Using his left leg, the Great Truth Sect leader attempted a devastating kick, but once more, Muguk anticipated the move and countered it with his own kick. Harnessing the momentum, Muguk tightened his grip on the sword. Within the span of a single breath, he thrust forward. The Great Truth Sect leader narrowly reacted in time, pulling himself down to dodge the piercing strike. He flipped back several steps using his hand to create distance, trying to regain his footing. His mind raced. Every technique he launched had been neutralized with what appeared to be with ease. Through gritted teeth, he struggled to comprehend how even he, someone with greater inner energy, had failed to land a single decisive blow. It defied reason. By all appearances, he was stronger, yet in every exchange, he fell short. For those with a deep understanding of martial arts, it was no mystery. In the core of a practitioner's body lies the dantian, where energy is stored. This flowing life force, known as internal energy, could be refined. Through discipline, internal energy could be polished and condensed, becoming far more powerful, just as Muguk had done. Though his quantity of inner energy was less, its quality and solidity were superior. This process was the essence of internal arts, the foundational bedrock of all martial arts disciplines. Yet, many misunderstood this concept, confusing internal arts with the mere accumulation of inner energy. The Great Truth Sect exemplified this confusion as their leader continued to be countered by Muguk at every turn. If one were to focus only on the force and volume of internal energy, it might be described as internal energy force. However, internal arts went further, refining internal force through meditation and mental cultivation, aiming toward enlightenment. Possessing strong internal force did not equate to mastering internal arts. Muguk's martial prowess stood as proof. Time and again, Muguk intercepted and neutralized each of the leader's strikes. As the exchanges wore on, the Great Truth Sect leader began to lose composure. With precision, Muguk struck the sword, causing it to falter, though the Great Truth Sect leader managed to keep his grip. In one fluid movement, he caught the leader's arm, then, in a flash, surged forward, slicing through the right side of his body. The wound was severe enough to cause the Great Truth Sect leader to cough up blood, staining Muguk's blade in crimson. Despite the damage, Muguk did not stop. Though the grip of his sword hand wavered, he raised it again, ready to strike. Years of buried resentment boiled to the surface. With everything he had, he drove his blade forward, intent on ending the conflict once and for all. The Great Truth Sect leader failed to react in time. Death was certain, unless something interrupted. Blood splattered again. Disciples from the Great Truth Sect stared in shock, witnessing the unimaginable. Even the referee was left speechless, eyes wide and jaw slack as he struggled to process what had just occurred. Muguk's blade had halted mid-strike. The Great Truth Sect leader remained unaware of how close death had come. Standing to interfere between them, Mu Hui had stopped Muguk's sword with his bare hand. Though capable of raising the Great Truth Sect at any moment, Mu Hui recognized that this was the right course to take. His grip was absolute. Muguk's sword trembled, but Mu Hui's hand held firm, showcasing mastery so refined that his muscles seemed forged from steel. Mu Hui addressed Muguk not with reprimand, but with respectful acknowledgement as the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect, telling him to calm down, and that was enough. Tears streamed down Muguk's face. The resentment he carried, birthed from the schemes that cost him his firstborn son, was unbearable. For several breaths, he clenched his teeth and fought to compose himself. Pain still lingered, but the future of the sect mattered more. He finally pulled his sword, leaving Mu Hui's hand bloodied in the process. The Great Truth Sect leader collapsed to his knees as soon as Muguk's killing intent dissipated. With that, the Fresh Flower Sect secured its second victory as the referee announced the result. Cheers erupted from the Fresh Flower Sect side. One disciple declared with joy that there was no need to leave Waynon. The Great Truth Sect leader's mind spun with disbelief. Losing to Muguk was something he never imagined, yet it had happened. Even in defeat, his scheming had not ceased. Yonho clicked his tongue in frustration. From his perspective, the Great Truth Sect leader could have emerged victorious had he maintained composure. But his downfall was inevitable, rooted deeply in his own volatile nature. Now, Yonho pondered the possibility of facing Mu Hui, someone he had always regarded as nothing more than a child. Regardless of whether he won the upcoming duel or surrendered before it began, the Fresh Flower Sect had already secured victory in the dispute. Hyen's voice echoed as he announced that, with 2 duels already won, the Fresh Flower Sect had claimed overall victory. However, to honor the rules, the final duel would proceed. He then called for the next participants to step forward. Muguk turned to Mu Hui and offered an apology. He admitted that his emotions had gotten the better of him, which ended up causing harm. With the last duel being meaningless in terms of outcome, he suggested that Mu Hui simply surrender. However, Mu Hui dismissed the concern, stating that the blood on his hand was not his own. The sword had been soaked in blood, and he assumed it transferred to his hand when he caught the blade. It was the blood of the Great Truth Sect leader. Muguk was taken aback. The sword strike had been delivered with full force, yet Mu Hui had stopped it barehanded without a scratch. He had always known the young man was talented, but not to such a degree. While Muguk was still lost in thought, Mu Hui casually attempted to clean the blood from his hand. At that moment, the Great Truth Sect leader raised his voice, drawing their attention. He acknowledged his sect's defeat, but pleaded for Muguk's understanding, asking for a favor despite the outcome. Muguk scoffed, unimpressed by the plea. Still, the leader persisted, offering to hand over all rights now that they had lost. Calm and composed, Muguk responded with disdain. To think the man who had so desperately tried to drive them out of Waynon would become so pitiful when truly tested. It was laughable. There was no scenario in which the Fresh Flower Sect would accept his empty words at face value. Then, without warning, Mu Hui transmitted a silent message, requesting to handle the remainder of the situation himself. Muguk gave a subtle nod, fully entrusting the matter to the young martial artist. Mu Hui addressed the Great Truth Sect leader with mockery, remarking on the sheer thickness of his skin and the second-hand embarrassment it brought. He then made a proposal. If the Great Truth Sect could win the final duel, they would be allowed to stay in Waynon. However, should the Fresh Flower Sect win, the Great Truth Sect would not only leave, but also offer something more, thus giving true meaning to the final duel. The Great Truth Sect leader agreed, and said he would offer the sect's rights if they lost. But Mu Hui immediately rejected the notion. Once the sect left Waynon, all their rights would naturally fall to the Fresh Flower Sect. That offer held no value. If the offer did not include something unattainable through the duels alone, then there was no point. He threatened to rescind the proposal if the terms weren't improved. Internally, the Great Truth Sect leader cursed the cunning youth before him. There were no options left. At last, he offered 5 great merit pills. Mu Hui accepted with satisfaction, remarking that the sect leader should have made that offer from the beginning. As the leader of the Fresh Flower Sect, Muguk formally accepted the terms. He reiterated the condition. Should the Great Truth Sect win the final duel, they would remain in Waynon. If they lost, they would relinquish 5 great merit pills and leave Waynon behind. Yonho stepped into the arena, acknowledging that with the new stakes, he could neither afford to lose nor concede. As he drew his sword, he added a warning. Facing his blade technique would prove difficult for a young martial artist, and surrendering now might be the wiser choice. But Mu Hui showed no hesitation. Instead, a thrill surged within him as he answered the provocation with calm defiance. No martial art in this world was truly easy to overcome. After all, within himself, Mu Hui felt a rush of exhilaration. Since awakening in this new body, he had long awaited an opportunity like this. At last, he could fully test his martial skills against a true martial artist, the Blade Master, Yonho. Tiger-repelling swordsman was a nickname given to Yonho because of his remarkable ability to repel even tigers with his sword. Mu Hui recalled meeting him in his past life as Dako Hien. Yonho had once challenged him to a duel, and Mu Hui remembered it clearly. Yonho had been a capable swordsman from Shanxi. Though he had held his own longer than Mu Hui expected, it only took 3 moves before Yonho was unable to continue the fight. Mu Hui reflected that, had his sword not broken back then, he could have endured at least 10 more moves. Now, facing Yonho again, Mu Hui wondered how much his opponent had improved over the years. Hyen's voice echoed across the arena, announcing that both sides were ready for the duel. The sparring would begin. As soon as the duel started, Yonho vanished from sight. At least, that was how it seemed to the spectators. However, to Mu Hui, his opponent's movements were as clear as daylight, despite the incredible speed. Observing from the sidelines, Muguk was stunned. He had expected the tiger-repelling swordsman to be strong, but Yonho's speed far surpassed even the great sect leaders. Muguk's attention shifted to Mu Hui. Muguk assumed for Mu Hui, who was known for his martial arts, seemed to struggle to follow Yonho's movements. This duel was proving to be more dangerous than he had anticipated. Having found his angle, Yonho struck from the side with explosive speed. However, Mu Hui followed his opponent's movements effortlessly, deflecting the sword attack with ease. Yonho's face revealed a hint of surprise as he saw that Mu Hui had managed to block the strike. Without hesitation, Mu Hui responded. He thrust his palm upward with force, executing the falling blossom palm. The impact sent Yonho staggering several steps back. Sensing the opening, Mu Hui closed the distance with the same speed Yonho had used earlier. Yonho realized this fight would not be as easy as he had initially thought. Mu Hui's barrage of attacks pushed Yonho's swordsmanship to its limit, while Mu Hui also tested his own martial arts. The spectators were left in awe by the sheer speed of the exchange. One spectator wondered aloud whether this was truly a sparring match. It didn't look like they were merely exchanging sword strikes. Instead, it seemed like light was being produced with every swing. Muguk, who had a deeper understanding of martial arts, recognized the truth. He realized the flashes of light were not light at all, but sparks created by the collision of their swords. As expected, the tiger-repelling swordsman was no slouch. On the other hand, Manhwa watched the duel, confused. She had expected far more from Yonho, the renowned tiger-repelling swordsman. The reality in front of her was not what she had envisioned. He seemed far weaker than she had expected. She then wondered why her senior brother was holding back. In the arena, Yonho managed to block most of Mu Hui's lightning-fast strikes. Though he was a seasoned martial artist, a few attacks grazed him. Blood spurted from a wound on his leg, and another appeared on his hand. He acknowledged that Mu Hui was no ordinary opponent. This rookie had exceeded his expectations, but Yonho still felt confident. This level of skill, however impressive, was not enough to defeat him. Determined to end the duel, Yonho gathered his inner energy and poured it into his sword. The sword erupted with power as he unleashed the 4 sons of ferocious fangs, a technique designed to deliver a decisive blow. His sword surged toward Manhwa with a roar of energy. Manhwa, maintaining his calm composure, stepped back, prepared for the incoming attack. The sword technique came at him relentlessly, but he raised his own sword with ease, ready to block the powerful strike. He thought to himself that Yonho had used this very technique when he attacked him in his past life. Back then, Manhwa's sword had shattered Yonho's sword technique with a single blow. Now, Manhwa gathered his inner energy into his sword, wanting to see if his understanding of Manhwa's swordsmanship held up. Time seemed to crawl as Manhwa's sword changed its form, the color of plum blossoms tinging the sword. With a rotational movement, Manhwa swung his sword, and the radiating plum blossom followed the sword's trace, deflecting another barrage of attacks from the 4 sons of ferocious fangs. His sword completed a full circle, the sword energy swirling before him and clashing with Yonho's sword energy. Watching closely, Manhwa noticed that her senior brother might have performed the falling plum returning circle. But Wujin thought differently. The technique felt unlike the falling plum returning circle they knew. Once the circle formed, the swirling energy severed Yonho's sword energy. Wujin concluded that Manhwa's technique felt more aggressive. The falling plum returning circle was fully performed, and the whirlwind of Manhwa's sword energy bloomed into a massive plum flower, consuming the 4 sons of ferocious fangs and charging straight for Yonho. The members of the Great Truth Sect were in shock. Their eyes widened in disbelief as the radiating plum blossom filled the entire arena. Yonho stood helplessly, unable to defend against the attack that, despite its refined and profound origins, was now being charged toward him aggressively. Like a wave of tsunami, Manhwa pressed forward, the technique fully bloomed. With a feeble attempt, Yonho raised his sword to defend, but the countless sharp inner energy petals, shaped like plum blossoms, cut through his defense. Soon, his inner shield was completely crushed, and he lost consciousness. Manhwa stood silently as Yonho staggered to his knees, eventually collapsing helplessly. Manhwa felt disappointed, muttering to himself that Yonho was far too weak for any kind of testing. Hyen's voice rang out, announcing that the match was over. The winner was Manhwa of Manhwa Sect, and the victory of the sparring match went to the Fresh Flower Sect. The Great Truth Sect fell into silence, their spirits crushed by yet another loss. Now, they would have to pay the fortune promised in the 3rd duel. Under his breath, the leader of the Great Truth Sect murmured that this shouldn't have happened. He wondered what they would do now. Hyen entered the arena and handed Manhwa a box, saying that as promised, he would now hand over the 5 Great Merit Pills to the winner. Manhwa accepted the box, and the disciples of the Fresh Flower Sect murmured among themselves about how remarkable the disciples of Manhwa Sect truly were. With the rare elixirs in hand, Manhwa smiled contentedly and turned his gaze toward the Great Truth Sect side. The experienced tiger-repelling swordsman had been easily defeated, making everyone wonder who this young man truly was. However, Manhwa did not concern himself with the murmuring. Instead, he sent a voice transmission to the leader of the Great Truth Sect. Losing the 5 Great Merit Pills must have been difficult for him. The leader was surprised, wondering how Manhwa knew that someone was backing the sect. Manhwa continued, explaining that it was obvious. There was no way a small sect like the Great Truth Sect could obtain such expensive elixirs without outside help. No matter how much money they had, it was simply impossible. Manhwa walked off, smugly muttering under his breath that the sect providing such rare elixirs must have been quite influential. He concluded that he would enjoy these elixirs now and bid them to take care. The leader of the Great Truth Sect could only stay silent, even after the provocation. Yet something else occupied his mind. Somewhere in the distance, veiled by the shadows of the trees. A figure observed the entire scene as the Great Truth Sect lost the duel. The night arrived, and the victor remained in Waynon. Most of the Fresh Flower Sect were indulging in their victory over the duel, celebrating with drinks to their heart's content. This included Muguk, who drank until he was senseless. His mind wandered from the loss of his first child to the grueling, hellish training he had endured, and finally to the victory over the Great Truth Sect, which brought him a sense of peace. When asked about his performance, Muhui explained that he had no particular reason for holding back against the tiger-repelling swordsman. He simply wanted to test his martial arts, and for that, he felt the need to make himself appear easy to beat. Meanwhile, the four disciples were sneaking out under the cover of night, preparing to leave Waynon. Muchiol remarked that he had noticed the falling plum returning circle Muhui had used seemed different from what they knew. On the other hand, Wu Jin, curious, asked why they were leaving at night. Muhui replied that it was simply a hassle to stay. Listening to the Fresh Flower Sect leader's incessant whining was exhausting. If they left tomorrow, they'd have to deal with more people. Since they had obtained the Great Merit Pills, Muhui wanted to leave before things became more annoying. Mujin agreed, exclaiming that it made sense. Muhua then asked if their next destination was Mount Yeo, which Muchiol confirmed this. Inwardly, Muhui thought to himself that while that was true, it wasn't the only reason for leaving. He was also hoping to run into the figures who had been hiding before. Perhaps they had already completed their tasks, or were handling matters from afar. He couldn't be sure. What could those figures be after? Why did they choose to support the Great Truth Sect leader? Meanwhile, far from their current location, Yonho had already been dispatched to King Yama. Two figures were seen wrapping things up, and only the Great Truth Sect leader remained to deal with.